I spent 5 years quietly saving $100,000 to buy my dream home, far away from my toxic family. But right in the middle of my biggest corporate pitch, my mother bulldozed past. Building security slammed a police report onto the glass table in front of 25 senior partners and demanded I use every penny of my savings to bail my sister out of jail. I did not panic. I just smiled, looked her dead in the eye, and dropped a single sentence that completely destroyed her golden child illusion. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your peace and your wallet from entitled family members. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old and the director of forensic accounting at one of Atlanta's top-tier financial firms. Getting to this position was not just a steady climb up the corporate ladder. It was a daily, exhausting battle for basic respect. Being a Black woman in a highly conservative corporate space, dominated by older, wealthy men, meant I had to be absolutely flawless at all times. I could never afford to have an off day. I could not be too loud, too quiet, too assertive, or too passive. I spent years swallowing countless microaggressions, like being told how surprisingly articulate I was during meetings, or having my flawless financial models double-checked by junior associates who barely understood basic calculus. But I put my head down, built an undeniable track record of saving our clients millions, and finally earned my seat at the head of the heavy mahogany table. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The central air conditioning hummed quietly in the 54th floor boardroom. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the downtown Atlanta skyline, but all eyes in the room were entirely focused on me. I was exactly 20 minutes into pitching a massive forensic audit strategy for a Fortune 500 client. 25 senior partners were sitting around the table taking notes and nodding in agreement. This was the critical presentation that would officially solidify my path to becoming a full partner at the firm. I was completely in my element, breaking down complex offshore tax shelters and hidden liabilities, feeling the genuine respect radiating from the very people who used to doubt my capabilities. Then the heavy glass doors of the boardroom violently swung open. The loud thud of the door hitting the acoustic wood panels echoed through the large room. I stopped mid-sentence, my laser pointer freezing on the projection screen. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. There, standing in the doorway, and aggressively shrugging off the frantic grasp of our front desk receptionist, was my mother, Brenda. She was 58 years old and dressed in her absolute best Sunday church service attire. She wore a tailored cream skirt suit, a double strand of pearls, and a wide-brimmed hat. In our community, my mother was the undisputed queen of respectability politics. She cared deeply, almost obsessively, about how things looked to the outside world, fiercely maintaining a carefully constructed facade of perfect wealth, grace, and upper-middle-class superiority. But right now, that perfectly manicured facade was completely unhinged. Her face was flushed dark red with frantic anger, and her expensive heels clicked sharply and violently against the hardwood floor as she marched directly toward me, completely ignoring the room full of shocked, wealthy executives. "Mrs. Washington, you absolutely cannot go in there," the receptionist pleaded, her voice trembling as she tried to block the path. "I am speaking to my daughter," my mother snapped loudly, her voice dripping with absolute entitlement as she swatted the air as if the young woman were nothing more than a bothersome gnat. I stood entirely frozen at the head of the long table. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the faint hum of the projector fan. Some of the partners exchanged bewildered and highly uncomfortable glances. Others stared intently down at their legal pads, deeply embarrassed by the sudden unprofessional intrusion. In the span of just 10 seconds, my mother had forcefully invaded my professional sanctuary, the one secure place in my life where my competence and hard work shielded me from her endless emotional chaos. She reached the front of the room, stopped right next to my presentation screen, and slammed a crumpled stack of papers onto the polished mahogany table. The loud smack made one of the older senior partners physically jump in his expensive leather chair. I looked down at the papers. It was a police precinct booking printout from the county jail. Your sister is in a holding cell, my mother demanded, her voice echoing aggressively off the glass walls. She did not bother to whisper. She did not ask me to step outside into the hallway for a private conversation. She wanted the audience. She wanted the maximum amount of social pressure. Mom, I said, keeping my voice incredibly low, calm, and perfectly measured. I am in the middle of a vital board meeting. We can step into the hallway to discuss this. We are not stepping anywhere, Kendra, she shouted, leaning over the table and pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. Jasmine was arrested this morning for grand larceny and wire fraud. Her bail is set at $100,000 flat. I know for a fact you have exactly that amount sitting in your high-yield savings account for your little house fund. You need to wire it to the bondsman right this second. I stared at her, absorbing the sheer audacity of her demand. Jasmine is my 32-year-old sister. She has always been the family golden child, a former local pageant queen, and the supposedly perfect daughter who married Trent, a slick and fast-talking white real estate investor. My mother worshipped the ground Trent walked on and treated Jasmine like absolute royalty. Meanwhile, I was constantly dismissed as the bitter workaholic who refused to settle down and focused entirely too much on my career. Jasmine spent her days posting luxury designer shopping sprees, expensive leased cars, and five-star vacations on social media to impress her followers. Now the reality had caught up with her, and she was sitting in a freezing county jail cell for serious financial crimes. I am not emptying my life savings account for Jasmine, I replied evenly, refusing to break eye contact or show a single ounce of intimidation. My mother let out a loud and highly theatrical gasp. She turned and looked directly at my colleagues, weaponizing her guilt trip in front of the very people I had worked so incredibly hard to impress. Look at her, my mother announced to the room of 25 men, throwing her hands up in the air dramatically. Her own flesh and blood is sitting in a concrete cell right now, and she is up here playing dress-up in a corporate suit, pretending she is better than us. You have always been insanely jealous of Jasmine. You have always hated that she got a good, successful man like Trent, and you ended up alone with nothing but your spreadsheets. A few of the partners visibly cringed at the highly personal attack. I could feel the heat of deep humiliation rising in my chest, but my forensic accountant brain immediately took over. Emotion is a severe liability in a crisis. Data is power. Call Trent, I said calmly, crossing my arms defensively. He is the millionaire real estate mogul, is he not? Why does he not just write a check and bail his own wife out of jail? My mother's face turned a deep and furious shade of crimson. Trent's assets are temporarily frozen because of a minor misunderstanding with an investor fund, she hissed defensively. He is completely devastated. He cried on the phone to me. He begged me to come to you to do the Christian thing. He said it is only a temporary loan until the bank clears his accounts. The absolute audacity of the request was breathtaking. They fully expected me to casually sacrifice the money I had painstakingly saved by working grueling 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, and building my career from absolute scratch. All of this just to rescue the sister who constantly mocked my ambition and the brother-in-law who openly belittled my profession at every single family gathering. They wanted me to be the financial sacrificial lamb just to maintain their pathetic illusion of a perfect wealthy lifestyle. I slowly closed my laptop. The soft click seemed incredibly loud in the tense and absolutely quiet room. I looked around at the senior partners, offering a brief and apologetic nod, and then turned my full, unyielding attention back to my mother. She stood there panting slightly, fully expecting me to crumble under the heavy weight of her public shaming. She expected me to pull out my phone and initiate a massive wire transfer right then and there just to make her stop making a humiliating scene. Instead, I reached over to the boardroom phone console sitting in the center of the table and firmly pressed the button for building security. Yes, Miss Washington, the security desk answered immediately over the clear speakerphone. We have an unauthorized and hostile visitor in the 54th floor boardroom. I said, my voice steady, cold, and echoing with absolute, unshakable authority. Please send a security detail to escort her off the premises immediately. My mother let out a shrill shriek of disbelief. You are calling security on your own mother, you selfish, miserable, ungrateful child. I will have you completely written out of the family trust for this. I will take the deed to your grandmother's property and burn it to ashes before I ever let you have it. I just looked at her entirely unfazed by the threat. I had spent 35 years of my life being the family punching bag and the financial backup plan. But today, right in this glass room, the cycle officially ended. I was not the scared little girl, desperately seeking her conditional approval anymore. I was a top-tier forensic accountant, and I already knew exactly what they were hiding. My mother realized instantly that her threat of disinheritance had bounced right off me. Instead of retreating, she decided to double down on the spectacle. She turned away from me and faced the table of executives, her arms spread wide as if she were delivering a sermon to a crowded congregation. "Look at her." My mother projected her voice trembling with forced emotional agony. "I want all of you to look at the woman you are about to make a partner. You think she is so brilliant with your money, but she has a heart made of solid ice. I did everything right. I raised two beautiful, educated black women in a world that wants to see us fail. We go to church every Sunday. We give to charity. We uphold the image of a proper family. But Kendra has always been broken inside." I watched the senior partners shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Richard, our managing director, softly cleared his throat and attempted to stand up to intervene, but my mother raised her hand sharply, silencing a billionaire CEO in his own boardroom. "She is a bitter single workaholic," my mother continued, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "She sits up here in her ivory tower playing with numbers all day because she has absolutely no one to go home to. She is punishing her sister because Jasmine has a perfect life. Jasmine is beautiful. Jasmine is a dedicated mother. And most importantly, Jasmine found a wonderful, successful man who actually takes care of her. Kendra cannot stand the fact that a man like Trent would never look twice at a woman who is married to a spreadsheet. She wants her own sister to rot in a jail cell just to satisfy her own miserable jealousy." The air in the room was incredibly thick. The silence was suffocating. I felt the familiar sting of her words, the same identical insults she had hurled at me since I was a teenager, studying for the SATs while Jasmine was out buying prom dresses. But the sting vanished just as quickly as it arrived, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. My mother reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her phone. She stabbed at the screen with her perfectly manicured fingernail and hit the speaker button, placing the phone squarely in the center of my presentation documents on the table. The phone rang twice before a smooth, deep voice answered. "Brenda," the voice said, sounding perfectly weary and distressed. "Please tell me you got the money. The bail bondsman said they are going to transfer Jasmine to the county correctional facility if we do not post the 100,000 in the next hour. She is crying, Brenda. They are treating her like a common criminal." It was Trent. His voice dripped with the slick, practiced charm of a man who sold overpriced real estate seminars to desperate people. "I am sitting here with Kendra right now," my mother said, leaning over the phone so her voice would pick up clearly. "But she is being stubborn, Trent. She is refusing to help her own blood. Tell her what you told me. Explain the situation to her so she understands this is an emergency." A heavy, perfectly timed sigh came through the speaker. Trent was putting on an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. When he spoke again, his tone shifted from distressed husband to condescending authority figure. "Kendra, sweetie," Trent said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet boardroom. "Listen to me. I know we have our differences. I know you do not always agree with my traditional views on marriage and family. But this is not the time to hold a grudge. This is about protecting Jasmine." I said absolutely nothing. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to keep talking to fill the void. "Look, my hands are completely tied right now," Trent continued smoothly, seamlessly, slipping into his corporate jargon. "The Securities and Exchange Commission is doing a routine compliance audit on my primary investment fund. It is completely standard procedure for a portfolio of my size, but it means all my liquid capital is temporarily frozen by the bank. I have millions tied up in escrow, but I cannot access a single dime today. I just need you to float this 100 grand to get my wife out of a cage. I will wire the money back to your account by next Tuesday, and I will even throw in a 20% interest bonus for your trouble." The sheer confidence of his lies was almost impressive. "You make great money," Kendra, Trent added, his tone taking on a subtle edge of a command. "You do not have a mortgage. You do not have kids. That money is just sitting there doing nothing. Be the bigger person for once. Do the Christian thing. Jesus teaches us to sacrifice for our loved ones. Do not let your pride ruin your sister's life over a temporary cash flow issue. My mother nodded vigorously along with his words, tears of self-righteousness finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. You hear him? She demanded, glaring at me. He is a good man going through a temporary hardship. He is begging you. Are you really going to sit there and let your family collapse out of pure spite? I kept my posture perfectly straight. My mind was rapidly processing every single word Trent had just said. Routine compliance audit, primary investment fund, millions in escrow, a temporary cash flow issue. Any ordinary person would have been overwhelmed by the pressure. Having your mother scream at you in front of your bosses while your wealthy white brother-in-law lectures you about Christian values on speakerphone was designed to force a panicked surrender. They expected me to cave. They expected me to authorize the wire transfer just to make the public humiliation stop. But they had made one massive irreversible miscalculation. They forgot what I actually do for a living. I do not just play with numbers. I hunt for financial anomalies. I dismantle corporate fraud. I track missing assets across international borders for a living. And thanks to my own private curiosity over the past few weeks, I had already looked into Trent's supposed real estate empire. I slowly reached out and picked up the phone from the table. I held it close to my face, ensuring every single syllable I spoke would be heard crystal clear by Trent, my mother, and the 25 executives watching the show. Trent. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. It is genuinely fascinating listening to you try to use complex financial terminology in a room full of actual forensic accountants and corporate attorneys. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my words settle over the speakerphone. I could hear him breathing on the other end, waiting for me to capitulate. First of all, I continued, my tone sharp and clinical. A routine Securities and Exchange Commission compliance audit does not trigger a total freeze on a managing partner's personal liquid assets. Furthermore, an escrow account is heavily regulated by third-party custodians. If your bank has suddenly frozen your personal checking and savings accounts, it means you have either triggered a suspicious activity report for money laundering or you are completely insolvent. Which one is it, Trent? The boardroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. My colleagues, men who managed billions of dollars in assets, were staring at the phone with morbid fascination. I had just dismantled his entire white savior financial guru persona in less than 30 seconds. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Now listen here, Kendra. Trent stammered, his smooth southern charm rapidly evaporating and being replaced by a defensive, aggressive edge. You do not know what you are talking about. You are just a glorified bookkeeper. I am dealing with high-level real estate logistics that you could not possibly understand. You are being completely unhelpful and spiteful. I did not let him finish his tantrum. And secondly, I said, raising my voice just enough to cut entirely through his frantic rambling, I find the requested bail amount incredibly coincidental. I looked directly at my mother. Her self-righteous fury was beginning to crack, giving way to a flicker of genuine confusion. Jasmine's bail is set at exactly $100,000, I stated clearly, ensuring the phone microphone picked up every single syllable. Is it not strange, Trent, that just last week, your primary investment limited liability company filed a confidential police report claiming that exactly $100,000 had been mysteriously embezzled from your corporate accounts? My mother physically recoiled as if I had struck her. Her eyes darted from me to the phone on the table. Why exactly would I drain my hard-earned life savings to bail my sister out of a county jail cell? I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper, when you are the one who framed her to cover up your own missing money. Complete and total silence radiated from the speakerphone. Trent fumbled his words, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched stutter. He tried to say I was crazy, that I was making things up, that my numbers were wrong. But his voice was shaking uncontrollably. He knew that I knew. He knew the paper trail was already unraveling. Before he could formulate a coherent lie, the line abruptly clicked and went dead. He had hung up on us. I calmly reached out and placed the phone back down on the console. I turned my attention back to my mother. The perfectly manicured facade she had marched in with was now completely shattered. She looked from the dead phone to me, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. She desperately wanted to believe Trent, her perfect son-in-law, who represented everything she valued about social status and wealth. But the mathematical precision of my accusation had just planted a massive, undeniable seed of doubt in her mind. Before she could muster another defensive scream, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom opened again. Two large security guards in dark suits stepped into the room. They looked respectfully at the senior partners, then turned to me, awaiting my final instructions. "Please escort Mrs. Washington to the ground floor," I instructed the guards, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "And ensure her name is permanently added to the building do not admit list." The sheer humiliation of being officially thrown out of a corporate skyscraper finally snapped my mother out of her shocked silence. As the guards placed their hands politely but firmly on her elbows, her momentary confusion morphed back into pure, unfiltered rage. She could not accept being wrong, so she defaulted to the only weapon she had left. "You are a monster," she spat, fighting against their grip as they began to guide her backward toward the hallway. "You think you are so smart with your little investigations and your spreadsheets? You think you have this entire family figured out." She dug her expensive heels into the hardwood floor, forcing the two large guards to stop for a fraction of a second. She glared at me with absolute venom, her eyes wide and frantic. "You listen to me, Kendra," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "I still hold the title deed to your grandmother's house. I know you have been waiting 5 years for me to sign that property over to you like she wanted. But if you do not come to the family dinner this Sunday and formally apologize to Trent and your sister for these disgusting lies, I will sell that estate to the first commercial developer I can find. You will never see a single brick of your grandmother's legacy." The guards finally pulled her through the doors, her voice echoing down the long marble corridor until the heavy glass sealed shut behind them. The boardroom was perfectly silent once again. I stood at the head of the table, my heart pounding a steady, highly controlled rhythm against my ribs. I took a deep centering breath, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and turned back to the projection screen. I picked up my laser pointer, finding my exact place on the slide. As I was saying about the offshore tax shelters, I continued, my voice entirely unwavering. The managing director, Richard, let out a low chuckle of absolute disbelief. He shook his head in sheer respect, picked up his expensive fountain pen, and gestured for me to continue. The pitch was saved. My career trajectory remained completely intact. But as I effortlessly finished my presentation, my mind was already moving 10 steps ahead to the weekend. My mother thought she could use my beloved grandmother's legacy as a leash to force my financial compliance. She thought the upcoming Sunday dinner would be a carefully orchestrated ambush where the extended family could bully me into submission and force me to write a check. She had absolutely no idea that I was already planning to attend, and I was bringing an arsenal of financial destruction with me. Sunday afternoon in Atlanta brought a thick, humid heat that practically shimmered over the asphalt. I drove my paid-off Lexus down the winding, tree-lined streets of my mother's exclusive suburban neighborhood. This was a place where image was not just important, it was a highly competitive blood sport. The massive brick homes sat far back from the street behind perfectly manicured lawns and towering iron gates. As I turned onto her specific block, I immediately noticed the extreme lengths my mother went to just to maintain her neighborhood supremacy. Her two-story colonial-style house came into view. The front yard was a pristine carpet of vibrant green grass that required a professional landscaping crew to maintain twice a week. The white columns framing the front porch were freshly painted, and the imported azalea bushes were blooming in perfect symmetrical rows. From the sidewalk, it looked like the ultimate picture of generational Black wealth and uncompromising success. But my forensic accountant brain could never just look at the surface. I saw the hidden ledgers. I saw the crushing reality behind the illusion. I pulled up to the curb and parked right behind the two vehicles dominating the wide circular driveway. The first was my mother's gleaming silver Mercedes-Benz sedan. The second was Trent's massive black Range Rover. Both vehicles were meticulously washed and polished to a mirror shine. Both vehicles were also completely leased. I knew for a fact that my mother paid an exorbitant monthly premium for that Mercedes, just so she could casually toss the keys onto the table at her weekly church committee meetings. I also knew she had secretly skipped paying her property taxes for 2 consecutive quarters, just to afford the maintenance on the imported Italian marble she had recently installed in her foyer. She prioritized everything people could see and completely ignored the foundational cracks they could not. I looked at Trent's vehicle and noticed Jasmine's designer sunglasses resting carelessly on the dashboard. It was almost comical. Just 3 days ago, Trent was supposedly crying on the phone about frozen assets, and Jasmine was sitting in a freezing county holding cell for grand larceny. Yet here they were parking their $80,000 leased luxury vehicle in the driveway, as if absolutely nothing had happened. The absolute denial required to maintain this lifestyle was staggering. They operated on the delusion that if they just looked rich enough, the actual legal and financial consequences of their actions would simply vanish into thin air. I turned off my engine and sat in the quiet air-conditioned cabin of my car for a moment. I was not here for the Sunday roast. I was not here to break bread, heal emotional wounds, or engage in the toxic dance of fake apologies my mother had demanded in my boardroom. I was here for one single item: the title deed to my grandmother's house. Grandma Ruby was the exact opposite of my mother. She was a pragmatic, hardworking woman who did not care about designer labels or country club memberships. Decades ago, she purchased a modest 3-bedroom brick house in a neighborhood that nobody cared about at the time. She paid for it in cash. Over the years, as Atlanta rapidly expanded and gentrified, that little brick house became an absolute goldmine. When she passed away, she left the property entirely to me, knowing my mother would immediately sell it to buy something flashy and utterly useless. But because of a minor legal technicality during the probate process, the physical notarized title deed had been mailed to my mother's address. For 5 years, my mother had kept that piece of paper locked inside the mahogany desk in her home office. She used it as her ultimate leverage. Every time I set a boundary, every time I refused to fund one of Jasmine's luxurious weekend vacations, my mother would casually threaten to tie the estate up in endless legal battles or sell it out from under me to a commercial developer. Today, that leverage was going to be permanently removed. I knew my mother kept the spare key to her desk drawer hidden inside a hollowed-out decorative book on her bookshelf. My plan was simple: endure the initial ambush, wait for them to get distracted by their own arrogance, secure the deed, and walk right out the front door. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer, crisp white trousers, and sensible designer flats. It was power casual. I looked completely unbothered, which I knew would infuriate them more than anything else I could possibly do. I grabbed my heavy leather tote bag, stepped out into the oppressive Georgia heat, and locked my car doors. As I walked up the long, curving brick pathway to the front entrance, I could already hear the loud, animated voices leaking through the thick wood. The house was alive with the sounds of a traditional Sunday dinner. I could hear the faint bass line of classic soul music playing from the expensive surround sound system. I could hear the clinking of crystal wine glasses and the booming performative laughter of my Uncle Calvin. I knew Uncle Calvin and Auntie Denise would be holding court in the living room. They were my mother's most loyal enablers. They were the type of older relatives who measured a woman's entire worth by the presence of a wedding ring and her willingness to serve the men in the family. They had definitely been briefed on the situation at my office. My mother had likely spent the entire week calling every single relative, spinning a dramatic, tearful tale of how I viciously attacked Trent's character while he was going through a minor, completely innocent banking error. I was walking into a fully orchestrated kangaroo court. It sounded like a warm, loving family gathering. But I knew exactly what was waiting for me on the other side of that door. It was a perfectly laid trap. They were all in there eating food my mother probably put on a high-interest credit card, waiting for the disgraced, rebellious daughter to walk in and beg for their forgiveness. I did not knock. I never knocked at this house, mostly because my mother insisted that knocking made us look like strangers to the wealthy neighbors. I grasped the heavy brass handle, turned it, and pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The smell of roasted lamb, garlic potatoes, and expensive perfume hit me instantly. The foyer was spotless, gleaming with that Italian marble she could not actually afford. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air of the house wash over my face. I adjusted the strap of my tote bag on my shoulder, squared my posture, and stepped forward into the lion's den. I was not walking in as the family scapegoat anymore. I was walking in as the architect of their absolute financial destruction. I walked from the marble foyer into the formal dining room. The massive oak table was practically groaning under the weight of my mother's elaborate Sunday spread. There was a glazed spiral ham macaroni and cheese, baked in a heavy cast-iron dish-collared greens, simmering with smoked turkey, and a crystal pitcher filled to the brim with iced sweet tea. It was a feast designed to project absolute domestic perfection. But the thick tension in the room instantly curdled my appetite. Sitting right in the middle of this domestic theater was Jasmine. She was perfectly positioned at the center of the table, flanked by my mother on one side and Trent on the other. For a woman who had supposedly spent the previous morning terrified inside a concrete holding cell, she looked absolutely flawless. Her hair was freshly silk-pressed. Her makeup was expertly applied to give her a soft, vulnerable look, and she was wearing a pale pink cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. She was holding a tall glass of sweet tea with both hands, taking tiny, trembling sips, like a fragile bird recovering from a devastating storm. As soon as my sensible flats clicked against the dining room threshold, all conversation abruptly stopped. Every single pair of eyes turned toward me. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," Auntie Denise announced loudly from the far end of the table. Auntie Denise was my mother's older sister and the undisputed enforcer of traditional gender roles in our extended family. She wore a heavy floral dress and a deeply disapproving scowl. Next to her sat Uncle Calvin, a man who had not held a steady job in a decade, but still demanded absolute submission from every woman in his vicinity simply because he was a man. I pulled out an empty high-back chair opposite Jasmine and sat down slowly, resting my leather tote bag carefully by my feet. I did not serve myself any food. I just looked at them, waiting for the inevitable interrogation to begin. "Your mother told us what you did at your little office," Auntie Denise continued, pointing a heavily ringed finger in my direction. "Calling security on your own mother. Refusing to help your sister when she was in desperate need. I do not know who raised you to be so cold, Kendra, but it certainly was not the Lord." I kept my expression entirely neutral. "Auntie Denise," I replied evenly, "I am fairly certain the Lord does not approve of wire fraud either, but we can consult the scripture if you would like." Uncle Calvin slammed his heavy fist onto the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. "Do not get smart with your elders, Kendra," he barked, his chest puffing out with unearned authority. "You sit up there in that fancy high-rise building, making all that money, and you have completely forgotten where you come from. Family is everything. Family is the only thing that matters in this world. When your sister's husband asks you for help, you do not ask questions. You submit and you help him. Trent is the head of his household. He is dealing with complex business matters that are simply beyond your understanding." I looked directly at Uncle Calvin, completely unfazed by his loud volume. If Trent is the head of his household and he is dealing with such high-level business matters, then why is he begging his single sister-in-law for her savings account? The logic of my question hung heavily in the air. Auntie Denise immediately jumped in to deflect, rushing to protect the fragile male ego I had just accurately diagnosed. "You make too much money for a single woman anyway," Auntie Denise scoffed, waving her hand dismissively at my career. "What on earth does a single woman with no husband and no children need $100,000 for? You do not have a family to feed. You are just hoarding wealth out of pure selfishness while your sister suffers. Jasmine is a mother. Jasmine has a household to maintain. You should be honored that you are in a position to bless their marriage." I shifted my gaze to Jasmine. She let out a soft, highly calculated whimper and dabbed at the corner of her perfectly dry eye with a linen napkin. "It was so terrifying in that cell," Kendra Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling with practiced precision. "The guards were so mean to me. They took my jewelry. They treated me like an animal. I cried the entire time just praying that my big sister would come rescue me. But you left me there to rot. The emotional manipulation was layered so thickly, it was almost suffocating. In their twisted patriarchal reality, my money did not actually belong to me. My financial stability, earned through years of grueling corporate warfare and endless sleepless nights, was viewed as a communal family asset. Because I chose not to marry young, because I chose not to have children immediately, they viewed my life as fundamentally less valuable than Jasmine's. I was expected to be the family mule carrying the heavy financial burdens of their terrible decisions while they smiled for the neighborhood and attended country club brunches. Trent reached over and placed his large hand protectively over Jasmine's hand. He looked at me with a perfectly crafted expression of solemn disappointment. "We were really hoping you would come here today with an open heart, Kendra." Trent said, his voice low and soothing. "We are willing to forgive the things you said on the phone on Tuesday. We know you were just stressed from your little presentation, but we really need to come together as a family right now and make this right." My mother finally spoke up from the head of the table. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied my calm demeanor. "You are going to transfer the funds tomorrow morning, Kendra," she stated, completely bypassing a request and moving straight into a command. "We secured a temporary high-interest bond to get her out for the weekend, but it requires full collateral by Tuesday. You are going to pay it, and then you are going to apologize to Trent for ever doubting his integrity." I looked around the table at the faces of my family. They were a unified front of toxic entitlement. They honestly believed that if they just applied enough guilt, enough religious shame, and enough volume, I would break. They thought my silence was the beginning of my surrender. Instead, I reached for the crystal pitcher in the center of the table and calmly poured myself a glass of sweet tea. The ice clinked sharply against the glass. I took a slow sip, savoring the cold sweetness before carefully placing the glass back down on a woven coaster. I was not going to give them the screaming match they so desperately wanted. I was going to let Trent dig his own grave, and I was going to hand him the shovel. Trent stood up from his chair at the head of the table. He reached over and picked up the heavy silver carving knife and the large meat fork. In our family, the patriarch always carved the Sunday roast. Since my father passed away, that role had been aggressively handed to Trent by my mother. It was a highly symbolic gesture. It was my mother loudly announcing to the room that this white man was the new protector and provider of our family, despite the fact that he was currently attempting to extort my entire life savings. Trent smoothed his expensive silk tie and began expertly slicing the glazed ham. "Let us lower the temperature in the room," he said, using his smooth, heavily practiced corporate mediator voice. He placed a thick slice of meat onto Jasmine's plate, first offering her a soft, protective smile before turning his attention back to me. "Listen, Kendra." Trent continued, pacing his words to match the rhythmic slicing of the knife. "I completely understand why you reacted the way you did on Tuesday. You are a very hard worker. You sit at a desk all day crunching numbers for other people. It is a very safe, very stable little job. And for a single woman with no real assets to manage hitting $100,000 in a savings account is a massive personal achievement. I am genuinely proud of you for saving your pennies." The sheer weight of his condescension was almost a physical force in the room. He did not call me a director of forensic accounting. He called me a number cruncher. He reduced a decade of grueling corporate ascendance into a cute little hobby. He deliberately used language designed to put me in my place, utilizing the exact tone a teacher might use to praise a child for finishing a coloring book. And the worst part was watching my mother and Auntie Denise nod along in absolute agreement. They looked at him with sheer admiration, completely blinded by his tailored suit and his confident posture. "But you have to understand how the real world of high-level wealth generation actually operates," Trent lectured, pointing the tip of the carving knife vaguely in my direction. "In the commercial real estate sector, liquidity is extremely fluid. I move millions of dollars across multiple limited liability companies every single week. When you play at my level, you occasionally deal with bureaucratic red tape. The bank freezes an account over a minor paperwork error, and suddenly my cash flow is temporarily restricted. It is just the cost of doing big business." Uncle Calvin grunted in loud agreement, taking a large bite of his potato salad. That is exactly right, Uncle Calvin announced with his mouth half full. Real men take big risks. You cannot expect a woman who just looks at spreadsheets all day to understand the pressure of building an actual empire. I watched Trent carefully. I noticed the tiny bead of sweat forming right at his hairline. I noticed how tightly his knuckles gripped the handle of the carving knife. His body language was screaming absolute panic, but his voice remained perfectly dipped in arrogance. He was playing his role to perfection, relying entirely on the racial and gender dynamics of the room to shield him from any actual accountability. I am not asking for a handout, Kendra, Trent said, his tone shifting into a benevolent offer. I am actually offering you an exclusive investment opportunity. Next month, my firm is breaking ground on a massive mixed-use commercial development right in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. It is a $30 million project. Luxury condominiums, high-end retail space, the whole package. He paused to serve a plate of food to my mother, who beamed up at him like he was a visiting dignitary bestowing a great honor upon her home. Once the construction loans clear, escrow, Trent promised smoothly, I will personally wire you $120,000. That is your original $100,000, plus a 20% return on your investment. You cannot get those kinds of margins in your little high-yield savings account. Consider it a family bonus. You help Jasmine clear up this ridiculous legal misunderstanding, and I will help you build a real financial portfolio so you do not have to work for a boss for the rest of your life. He set the carving knife down and wiped his hands on a linen napkin. He looked at me with an expression of deep, patronizing pity. It was the look of a man who firmly believed his inherent privilege made him infinitely smarter than the black woman sitting across from him. He expected me to be dazzled by his big numbers. He expected me to be deeply grateful that he was willing to let me participate in his imaginary wealth. He honestly believed he could just throw out a few buzzwords like escrow and liquidity, and I would instantly hand over the money I had sacrificed 5 years of my life to save. It is a very generous offer, Kendra, my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Trent is willing to pay you back with interest. He is trying to help you grow your little house fund into something substantial. You should be thanking him instead of sitting there looking so aggressive and defensive. Jasmine let out a soft sigh and leaned her head against Trent's shoulder, playing her part as the delicate wife perfectly. He is always looking out for everybody else, she murmured softly, even people who do not deserve it. I sat perfectly still, letting the cold, sweet tea coat the back of my throat. The absolute audacity of the scene was truly a marvel to witness. Here was a man who had secretly drained my sister's credit, a man who was running a localized Ponzi scheme, standing at the head of our family table, offering me a 20% return on a completely non-existent real estate deal. He was actively destroying the very women who were currently defending him, and they were practically thanking him for the privilege. The trap was fully set. They had presented their terms. They had painted Trent as the generous savior, and me as the hostile, ungrateful spinster who needed to be humbled and taught a lesson in family loyalty. I slowly set my crystal glass down on the woven coaster. I looked at Trent, offering him a very small, perfectly polite smile. He thought he had the entire room under his complete control. But the time for listening was officially over, and I was exactly where I wanted him to be. A $30 million mixed-use commercial development right in the heart of Midtown Atlanta, I repeated slowly, letting the massive number hang in the stifling air of the dining room. That is an incredibly impressive undertaking, Trent, especially considering the current interest rates on commercial construction loans. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the heavy oak table. My voice remained perfectly pleasant, devoid of any obvious hostility. I was playing his exact game, but I knew the rules infinitely better than he did. Since you are offering me a 20% return on a $100,000 investment, I continued, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his. That makes me an accredited Tier 1 investor. Naturally, as a forensic accountant, I have a fiduciary duty to myself to perform basic due diligence before transferring any liquid assets. What is the exact name of the primary limited liability company holding the title for the land acquisition? Trent blinked. His charming smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly plastered it back on. Well, Kendra, he chuckled, shifting his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. As you know, large-scale developments involve multiple shell companies for liability protection. The primary holding company is wrapped in a blind trust right now for tax purposes. I cannot just casually throw the name around at the dinner table. I did not let him breathe. A blind trust, I noted, raising an eyebrow. Fascinating. But even a blind trust must file public zoning permits with the city. Midtown Atlanta has notoriously strict commercial zoning laws. Did your firm file for a variance regarding the retail to residential square footage ratio, or did you purchase a lot that was already zoned for high-density mixed use? The dining room fell completely silent. Uncle Calvin stopped chewing. My mother frowned, her eyes darting back and forth between Trent and me. They did not understand the specific terminology I was using, but they absolutely understood the sudden, overwhelming shift in the power dynamic. Trent swallowed hard. I could literally see the pulse hammering away in his neck. Listen, he started, his voice losing its smooth baritone resonance and pitching slightly higher. The zoning is being handled by my legal team. We are navigating the city council right now. It is highly confidential. We have a non-disclosure agreement with the current property owners until the escrow clears. A non-disclosure agreement on a building permit? I asked, allowing a sharp, genuine laugh to escape my lips. Trent building permits are municipal public records. They are legally required to be posted in the public domain the moment an application is submitted. You cannot put a non-disclosure agreement on a city zoning application. Furthermore, any $30 million project in that specific district requires an environmental impact study filed at least 6 months prior to breaking ground. Who did your environmental survey? Trent was visibly sweating now. The arrogant posture had completely vanished. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning totally white. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stuttering sound came out. He was drowning in his own lies, completely incapable of matching wits with someone who actually understood the financial jargon he had been using to manipulate my family for years. "Stop it!" Jasmine suddenly shrieked. The sharp, hysterical sound of her voice shattered the tension. Jasmine slammed her hands down on the table, her eyes wide and manic. She could not stand watching her husband, the source of her entire social identity, being publicly dismantled. Without another word of warning, Jasmine grabbed the heavy crystal goblet of red wine sitting next to Trent's plate and hurled the entire contents directly across the table at me. The dark red liquid hit my chest with a heavy splash, immediately soaking into my crisp white trousers and staining my tailored navy blazer. Chaos instantly erupted. My mother gasped loudly and jumped out of her chair. Uncle Calvin shouted something completely unintelligible, but nobody rushed to check on me. Instead, my mother and Auntie Denise immediately swarmed around Jasmine, who had collapsed back into her chair and begun aggressively sobbing, burying her face in her hands. "Look what you did!" My mother screamed at me over Jasmine's theatrical wailing. "You came into my house just to interrogate this poor man and upset your sister. You are evil, Kendra. You are completely toxic." I looked down at the dark red wine dripping from my lapel onto the expensive dining room rug. I did not flinch. I did not yell back. The physical assault was the absolute ultimate proof that I had backed them into a corner they could not escape. I slowly stood up from the table, picking up my heavy leather tote bag. "I am going to go to the powder room to clean up," I said calmly, completely ignoring the screaming women and the terrified, pale expression on Trent's face. I walked out of the dining room and stepped into the long hallway. I did not go to the bathroom. I walked straight down the corridor and slipped quietly into my mother's home office. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, instantly muting the chaotic screaming coming from the dining room. The room was perfectly still. I walked directly over to the large bookshelf against the wall. I reached for the thick, decorative encyclopedia on the third shelf, opened the hollowed-out center, and grabbed the small silver key. I moved to the mahogany desk, slid the key into the bottom right drawer, and turned it. The lock clicked open with a satisfying snap. I pulled the drawer open. There, sitting perfectly on top of a stack of old tax returns, was the notarized title deed to Grandma Ruby's house. A wave of profound relief washed over me. I picked up the thick parchment paper, quickly verified the seal and the signatures, and slid it safely into the deepest pocket of my leather tote bag. I locked the drawer, replaced the key in the hollow book, and took a deep, centering breath. My mother had officially lost her last piece of leverage over my life. I stepped back out into the hallway and walked slowly toward the front door. The family was still in the dining room. I could hear Trent frantically trying to calm Jasmine down, his voice shaking with absolute panic. I paused right at the threshold of the foyer, looking back into the dining room one last time. My mother looked up, expecting to see me humiliated and crying over my ruined clothes. Instead, she saw me standing tall by the front door, my hand resting firmly on the brass doorknob. "By the way, Trent!" I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. "I checked the Fulton County Clerk Registry and the State Commercial Property Database this morning. There are absolutely no building permits, no land acquisitions, and no limited liability companies registered under your name, Jasmine's name, or any of your known associates for any project in Midtown Atlanta." Trent froze perfectly still. His mouth dropped open. Jasmine stopped crying instantly, her tear-stained face snapping toward me in pure shock. "Your $30 million development does not exist," I stated coldly, looking directly at my mother. "He is lying to you. Do not call me again." I turned the knob, walked out into the sweltering Atlanta heat, and pulled the heavy front door firmly shut behind me. I drove back to my downtown condo in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call a friend to vent. I just let the cool air conditioning dry the faint red wine stain on my lapel and focused entirely on the puzzle ahead of me. Trent had shown his hand. He was desperate, volatile, and deeply embedded in a web of financial deceit that was unraveling faster than he could spin new lies. When I finally unlocked the door to my apartment, it was well past 7 in the evening. I dropped my heavy leather tote bag on the kitchen island and pulled my grandmother's title deed from the pocket. I carefully placed the thick parchment paper inside my personal fireproof safe, securing it with a complex numerical combination. That part of the battle was over. The legacy was safe. Now it was time to systematically dismantle the man who had tried to steal it. I walked into my home office. This was my true sanctuary. The room was dominated by an oversized matte black desk supporting 3 massive curved monitors. My firm had equipped me with state-of-the-art hardware dual processor towers and an incredibly secure encrypted connection to multiple national and international financial databases. I did not just have access to public records. I had access to the high-level investigative tools used to trace corporate espionage. I changed out of my ruined clothes, putting on a simple oversized college sweatshirt and soft cotton sweatpants. I tied my hair back into a tight bun, grabbed a large bottle of water from the refrigerator, and sat down in my ergonomic chair. I hit the power button on the master console. The 3 monitors immediately flickered to life, bathing the dark room in a sharp blue-white glow. I cracked my knuckles, a nervous habit I had developed during graduate school, and began the hunt. Trent had made a critical mistake during his arrogant speech at the dining room table. He used the words, "blind trust." In the state of Georgia, you cannot use a blind trust to purchase commercial property without first establishing a registered agent and a localized, limited liability company to act as the primary purchaser on the closing documents. If he was actively developing a $30 million project, there had to be a localized corporate entity attached to his name, even if it was buried under layers of legal jargon. I opened my primary investigative software, a powerful data aggregation tool that allowed me to simultaneously cross-reference municipal tax records, state corporate registries, and federal civil court filings. I started with the absolute basics. I typed in Trent's full legal name, his social security number, which I had easily obtained from an old joint tax return my mother had foolishly asked me to review years ago, and his current home address. I hit the Enter key and watched the progress bar load across the bottom of the center screen. The initial results were incredibly mundane. a few minor traffic citations, a perfectly clean personal credit score which was almost certainly Jasmine's doing since she managed their household bills. There were no immediate red flags on his primary consumer report. To the casual observer, Trent looked like a perfectly stable upper-middle-class citizen. But I was not a casual observer. I switched to the state corporate registry database and ran a reverse search on his home address, looking for any registered businesses operating out of their primary residence. Bingo. A list of 7 different limited liability companies popped up on the right monitor. They all shared the exact same registered address. Trent's house. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the names rapidly. Apex Real Estate Holdings, Summit Commercial Ventures, Vanguard Development Partners. They were all incredibly generic names designed to sound massive and authoritative while completely hiding the actual nature of the business. I clicked on the first company, Apex Real Estate Holdings, and pulled up the original articles of incorporation. The document was dated 3 years ago. I scrolled down to the ownership structure and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Trent was not listed as the primary owner or the managing director. Jasmine was. My sister. The woman who claimed she did not understand basic arithmetic and proudly let her husband handle all the big financial decisions was listed as the sole proprietor and managing director of all 7 corporate entities. I rapidly clicked through the remaining 6 companies. It was the exact same story across the board. Trent had strategically positioned Jasmine as the legal face of every single business venture. He was operating entirely as an undocumented consultant, meaning he had absolute control over the corporate bank accounts, but absolutely zero legal liability if the businesses collapsed. He had essentially weaponized my sister's pristine credit score to build his empire of dirt. I needed to see the money. I needed to see exactly how these shell companies were operating. I opened a secondary window and accessed the federal civil court database. If a company is moving millions of dollars in commercial real estate, they almost inevitably end up in civil court over contract disputes, zoning violations, or unpaid contractor invoices. I ran a blanket search across all 7 company names. The screen immediately populated with a massive wall of red text. My jaw tightened as I began reading the case summaries. These were not minor contract disputes. These were active, aggressive lawsuits filed by multiple private investors and construction supply companies. Summit Commercial Ventures was currently being sued by an independent roofing contractor for $65,000 in unpaid labor. Vanguard Development Partners was facing a massive civil suit from a group of elderly retirees who had pooled their savings to invest in a promised suburban housing development that had never broken ground. The lawsuits alleged that Vanguard had collected over $2 million in seed money only to continuously delay the project while charging exorbitant administrative fees. I pulled up the bank routing histories attached to the court discovery documents. This is where the real story is always told. People lie, words lie, but bank ledgers do not lie. I watched the money move across my screens in a mesmerizing, horrifying pattern. The elderly investors would wire funds into Vanguard Development Partners. Within 48 hours, those funds were transferred out of Vanguard and funneled into Apex Real Estate Holdings. From Apex, the money was then dispersed into multiple different directions. Some of it went to pay off the angry contractors suing the other shell companies. A large portion of it went directly to a luxury car leasing agency. And thousands of dollars were consistently wired into a high-interest offshore savings account located in the Cayman Islands. Trent was not a real estate developer. He was not navigating complex city zoning laws or managing a $30 million construction project in Midtown Atlanta. He was running a classic, highly localized Ponzi scheme. He was constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul. He would launch a new fake development project, collect seed money from gullible local investors using his slick church boy charm, and then use that new money to pay the interest on the older failing projects to keep those investors from calling the police. It was an incredibly stressful, incredibly volatile way to live, which explained his sudden panic over the frozen assets. The cycle was finally catching up to him. He had run out of new investors to scam, and the older investors were finally demanding their money back. But the most devastating part of the entire financial autopsy was the liability. Because Jasmine was listed as the sole proprietor of every single one of these fraudulent companies, she was legally on the hook for everything. If the whole house of cards collapsed, Trent could just walk away. He could claim he was merely an employee following the instructions of the managing director. Jasmine would be the one facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. The $100,000 bail she was currently out on was just the absolute tip of a massive civilization-ending iceberg. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. The blue light from the monitors cast long, harsh shadows across my dark office. I had expected to find unpaid taxes, or maybe a few maxed-out credit cards. I had not expected to uncover a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise with my own sister positioned perfectly as the sacrificial lamb. I took a long drink of water, my mind racing with the implications. Trent was using my family as a human shield, but he had made one fatal error. He thought he could outsmart me. My phone suddenly buzzed on the desk, shattering the quiet focus of the room. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was Jasmine. It was almost midnight. I stared at the phone, watching it vibrate against the dark wood. She had just thrown a glass of wine in my face a few hours ago, screaming that I was toxic and evil. Now she was calling me in the middle of the night. I took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and swiped to answer. I did not say hello. I just pressed the phone to my ear and waited for her to speak. Kendra, my sister, demanded, her voice sharp and completely devoid of the trembling vulnerability she had aggressively performed at the dinner table. My platinum card was just declined. I am trying to finalize an online order for a custom nursery crib for my friend's baby shower, and the transaction will not go through. The bank is doing that stupid security freeze again because Trent is moving funds around. I need you to wire me $5,000 right now to cover my expenses until Tuesday. I do not want to wake Trent up to deal with this. He has been under so much stress. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair. The blue light from the 3 monitors illuminated my face. Just hours ago, she had thrown a glass of red wine at me in front of our entire family, screaming that I was an evil, toxic monster. Now at midnight, she was casually demanding a $5,000 wire transfer to buy a luxury baby crib, operating under the absolute delusion that I was still the obedient family bank. Jasmine, I said, my voice completely flat. Why are you calling me instead of your husband? Because I just told you he is sleeping, she snapped, clearly annoyed by my lack of immediate compliance. He is managing a $30 million project. The bank froze his accounts. It is a minor technicality. Are you going to send the money, or are you going to keep being difficult? I reached over to my keyboard. I had already uncovered the corporate shell game and the massive lawsuits filed against the limited liability companies registered in her name. But I needed to see exactly how Trent had capitalized the start of this localized Ponzi scheme before he started stealing from new investors. I opened a highly secure financial terminal designed for running deep personal credit autopsies. I already had Jasmine's social security number from the tax documents my mother had given me years ago. You are not calling Trent because you already know he cannot fix it, I stated calmly, typing her information into the search fields. That is a lie, she shot back immediately. While she continued to loudly berate me for being unsupportive, I hit the enter key and pulled her comprehensive personal credit profile. The progress bar flashed across the screen. I knew my sister. For all her massive faults, she had always been incredibly meticulous about her personal credit. Before she married Trent, her score was an immaculate 820. She used to brag about it constantly, waving her pristine financial status around as just another proof of her superiority. The data populated on my center monitor. The number glowing in bright red font at the top of the screen made my blood run entirely cold. 412. Her credit score had been completely and utterly annihilated. I scrolled down through the detailed trade lines, and the horrifying realization of Trent's ultimate betrayal fully crystallized in front of me. Trent did not just make Jasmine the face of his fake companies. He had systematically weaponized her pristine credit to secure the high-interest predatory loans necessary to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. When you run a Ponzi scheme, the most dangerous moment is when an early investor demands their money back before you have successfully scammed a new investor. To bridge that gap, Trent had turned to merchant cash advances and unregulated alternative lenders. These lenders do not care about your business plan, they only care about the personal guarantor. Trent had taken out millions of dollars in short-term astronomical interest loans, and he had made Jasmine sign a personal guarantee for every single one of them. Jasmine. I interrupted her rant, my eyes scanning the endless rows of defaulted accounts. Did Trent make you sign documents declaring you the personal guarantor for Vanguard Development Partners? There was a slight pause on the line. Her tone shifted from aggressive to defensive. I am the Vice President of Acquisitions, Kendra. Obviously, I have to sign corporate paperwork. Trent handles all the boring legal details, he just highlights where I need to sign. It is a partnership. Not that you would understand how a real marriage works. You do not have a marriage, Jasmine, I said, the clinical detachment in my voice cutting right through her delusion. You have a hostage situation. Excuse me, she gasped, highly offended. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the exact figures. You are currently looking at a personal credit score of 412. You have 7 accounts currently in active default. Trent did not just open shell companies in your name. He tied your personal social security number to over $2.4 million in unregulated commercial debt. Your platinum card was not declined because of a security freeze. It was declined because the bank has completely revoked your credit lines due to severe delinquency. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. You are crazy. You are just jealous. My house is worth over $2 million alone. We have equity. Your house has 3 active liens on it. I corrected her, instantly pulling up the county property records on my third monitor. He took out a third mortgage 6 months ago using your electronic signature. You have absolutely no equity. I took a deep breath, laying out the absolute legal peril she was in. You signed personal guarantees, Jasmine. That means you waived the corporate veil. When these angry investors and construction contractors sue the limited liability companies, they are not going to stop at the business assets because there are no business assets. They are going to seize your house. They are going to garnish any wages you ever make. And because Trent kept his name completely off the official corporate registry, he has zero legal obligation to pay a single dime of it. Stop making things up, she screamed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. Trent loves me. He is a provider. He would never put me in jeopardy. He was just arrested for the wire fraud, not me. No, Jasmine, I said softly, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. Trent was not arrested for wire fraud. You were. He filed the initial police report claiming $100,000 was stolen from the business accounts. He framed you for the missing funds to buy himself time because the investors were threatening him. He let you sit in that freezing county holding cell, and then he played the desperate husband, begging me for the exact amount of money he needed to pay off his most violent creditor. He is setting you up to take the fall for the entire Ponzi scheme. You are a liar, Jasmine shrieked into the phone. You have always been a bitter, hateful liar who wants to see me fail. Do not ever speak to me again. The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear and placed it carefully on the desk. She had hung up on me, but I knew the damage was already done. The seed of absolute terror had been firmly planted in her mind. Jasmine could scream and deny the truth all she wanted. But the moment she tried to use another credit card, the moment she checked her own bank app, the beautiful, heavily filtered illusion of her perfect, wealthy life was going to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I sat back in the dark glow of the monitors. I felt no joy in my victory. I only felt a deep, overwhelming disgust for the man who had exploited my family's obsession with status to orchestrate such a comprehensive destruction. Trent had played them perfectly. He knew my mother and my sister valued the appearance of wealth far more than actual financial literacy. He knew they would blindly trust a slick white man in a tailored suit over their own flesh and blood. I closed the credit reporting software and began compiling every single document, every routing number, and every defaulted loan into a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Jasmine was entirely out of options, out of credit, and out of time. Her denial would not last the night. The sun had barely begun to rise over the Atlanta skyline when the aggressive pounding on my front door started. It was barely 6 in the morning on Monday. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, reviewing the massive encrypted dossier I had built the night before. The pounding was frantic and desperate, violently rattling the heavy brass knocker. I calmly closed my laptop, walked over to the entryway, and checked the security monitor. Standing in the hallway was Jasmine. She looked absolutely nothing like the perfectly styled pageant queen who had thrown a glass of wine at me during the Sunday dinner. Her silk-pressed hair was pinned up haphazardly, her face was completely bare of makeup, revealing dark, exhausted circles under her eyes, and she was wearing an oversized designer trench coat pulled tightly over a pair of simple sweatpants. The heavy, heavily filtered illusion she projected to the world had completely evaporated overnight. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before I could even say a single word of greeting, Jasmine pushed past me, stepping right into my foyer. She was physically trembling. She dropped her expensive handbag onto the floor and immediately burst into tears. And for the first time in perhaps 15 years, I could tell these were not the highly calculated theatrical tears she routinely used to manipulate our mother or her husband. These were the raw, ugly, suffocating tears of absolute panic. "Kendra, please," she sobbed, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach as she paced erratically across my hardwood floor. "You have to help me. You were right. You were right about everything." I closed the door and leaned against it, crossing my arms and watching her completely unravel. "I tried to log into my banking app after we got off the phone last night." Jasmine gasped, struggling to catch her breath, as the reality of her situation crushed her chest. "Everything is locked. The screen just said to contact the fraud department." I waited until Trent was completely asleep, and I went into his home office. I dug through his desk. I found letters, Kendra. Stacks of certified letters from collection agencies and corporate lawyers. He has been hiding them in a locked filing cabinet under a false bottom. "It is all gone. There is no $30 million project. We are completely broke." She collapsed onto one of my kitchen bar stools, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently. I felt a brief, fleeting pang of sisterly sympathy. We had grown up in the exact same toxic household. We had both been molded by a mother who taught us that a woman's entire worth was determined by her proximity to a wealthy, successful man and the image she presented to the church. Jasmine had simply followed our mother's blueprint to absolute perfection, and now that blueprint was leading her straight into a federal prison. I walked over to the kitchen counter and poured her a glass of cold water. I slid it across the marble island toward her. "What exactly do you want me to do, Jasmine?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle but entirely grounded in cold reality. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and pleading. She reached across the counter and grabbed my hands. Her manicured grip was painfully tight. "I need you to write me a check," she begged. "I know you have the $100,000, but I need more than that. I need you to pull a loan against your corporate retirement accounts. I need a blank check, Kendra. If I can just give Trent enough cash to pay off the most aggressive investors today, we can stop the civil lawsuits from going public. We can quiet this entire thing down before the police start looking into the businesses with my name on them. You are the only one in the family with actual liquid cash." I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. She had just discovered that her husband was a massive fraud who had stolen millions of dollars and legally framed her for his crimes, and her immediate instinct was not to hire a criminal defense attorney. Her instinct was to help him cover it up. She was entirely willing to drain my retirement accounts and my life savings just to buy Trent a few more weeks of fake freedom. "Jasmine, listen to me very carefully," I said slowly and firmly, pulling my hands out of her frantic grip. "I am not giving you a single dollar. If I give you my money, Trent is just going to use it to pay off the squeakiest wheel in his Ponzi scheme, and then he is going to steal it again. You cannot buy your way out of federal wire fraud." Her face fell. The desperate, pleading sister vanished in an absolute instant, quickly replaced by the cornered, terrified golden child. You have to do this, she demanded, her voice rising in pitch and volume. We are blood. You are supposed to protect your family. I am protecting you, I fired back, refusing to let her control the narrative for even a second. The only way you survive this is by filing for divorce today, going straight to the district attorney and handing over every single document you found in that filing cabinet. You need to testify against him before he officially pins the entire criminal operation on you. I will pay for the absolute best white-collar defense lawyer in Atlanta to represent you. That is the only help I am offering. Jasmine stared at me as if I had just slapped her directly across the face. Tell the district attorney, she repeated, her voice dripping with sudden venomous disgust. File for divorce. Are you completely insane? She stood up abruptly, knocking the heavy bar stool backward. It crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. If I divorce Trent and go to the police, my life is completely over. Jasmine screamed, the genuine tears instantly drying up as her pure, unfiltered entitlement completely took over. Do you have any idea how humiliating that would be? Everyone at our church, everyone at the country club, all of my friends, they would all know we are completely broke. I would lose the house, I would lose the cars, I would be an absolute laughingstock in this city. You are going to lose the house and the cars anyway, I told her bluntly, refusing to coddle her fragile ego. The bank has 3 active liens on your property. It is just a matter of time before the foreclosure notices are taped to your beautiful front door. Shut up! She shrieked, covering her ears like a petulant toddler. You do not know anything. Trent is a financial genius. He just made a few bad investments. If we just give him enough capital to breathe, he can turn it around. He always turns it around. But you want him to fail. You want me to fail so you can finally feel superior to me. I looked at her with profound, heavy exhaustion. She was so deeply addicted to the illusion of wealth that she was completely willing to go down with a sinking ship just to keep up appearances for people who did not actually care about her. Since you refuse to be a real sister? Jasmine sneered, bending down and aggressively grabbing her designer handbag from the floor. I will make sure you regret this for the rest of your miserable, lonely life. I am leaving here and driving straight to Mom's house. I am going to tell her that you fabricated all those financial numbers just to ruin my perfect marriage out of pure jealousy. And then I am going to make sure she calls her estate lawyer today. She marched toward my front door, her head held high in a pathetic, crumbling imitation of authority. You think you are so incredibly smart because you have a fancy corporate job? Jasmine spat, grabbing the deadbolt. But Mom controls the entire family trust. Every single dollar, every piece of jewelry, and every property my father left behind is in that trust. I will make sure you are completely written out of the will today. You will not get a single dime from this family ever again. You are entirely dead to us, Kendra. She yanked the heavy door open and slammed it shut behind her, the loud noise echoing violently through my quiet apartment. I stood alone in my foyer, the cool silence rushing back in to fill the space she had just polluted. She honestly thought the threat of being disinherited would finally break me. She thought I was still playing the old family game where my mother used the promise of future wealth to control my present behavior. But Jasmine had just unknowingly handed me the very next thread I needed to pull. I walked slowly back into my home office and sat down at my desk. The family trust. My mother had always aggressively bragged about the ironclad security of our family trust, using it as a weapon to enforce absolute loyalty from me. But Trent had proven he had zero respect for boundaries, and he was completely desperate for liquid cash. If Trent had successfully manipulated Jasmine into signing away her own financial future, I suddenly wondered what he had manipulated my mother into doing. I moved my mouse, woke up my 3 monitors, and opened a new secure search window. It was time to look into my mother's sacred trust documents. I opened the encrypted folder on my desktop labeled Family Trust. When I visited my mother's house for that disastrous Sunday dinner, securing my grandmother's title deed had been my primary objective. But while I was inside that mahogany desk drawer, my forensic instincts had taken over. I had used a high-resolution scanning app on my phone to quickly photograph every single page of the estate documents my mother kept so fiercely guarded. Now those photographs were perfectly aligned on my center monitor, converted into highly searchable digital files. For my entire adult life, the family trust had been my mother's ultimate weapon of absolute control. It was originally established by my late father, a hardworking man who spent 30 grueling years building a solid financial foundation for his wife and daughters. He worked 60-hour weeks, denying himself personal luxuries, so his family could live in a safe, affluent neighborhood. He wanted to ensure generational wealth. But after he passed away, my mother weaponized his legacy. The trust became a behavioral leash. If I declined to attend a country club gala, she threatened the trust. If I refused to pay for Jasmine's lavish vacations, she threatened the trust. Jasmine's parting threat this morning was just a desperate echo of the exact same manipulation I had endured for over a decade. I began scrolling through the digital pages, my eyes scanning the heavily legalistic language. At first glance, the asset ledger appeared completely intact. The checking and savings accounts held the expected modest balances. The conservative stock portfolio my father had established was still generating reliable quarterly dividends. Everything looked perfectly normal to an untrained eye. But forensic accounting is never about what is clearly visible on the page. It is entirely about finding the negative space. It is about spotting the subtle inconsistencies, the missing dates, and the sudden deviations from established financial patterns. I pulled up the schedule of real estate assets and immediately noticed a glaring anomaly. The schedule listed the primary residence, the sprawling two-story brick colonial home where my mother currently lived. My father had paid off the 30-year mortgage on that property 5 years before he died. He was incredibly proud of that massive achievement. He used to tell me that a black family owning their land outright was the ultimate form of freedom. The house was supposed to be completely unencumbered, owned free and clear by the family trust. However, attached to the very bottom of the property declaration was a highly unusual addendum dated 8 months ago. It was a notarized authorization form signed by my mother as the primary trustee, allowing a massive line of credit to be drawn against the equity of the estate. I felt a cold chill wash over me. I immediately switched back to my state property records database and typed in my mother's home address. The search results populated instantly. There, staring back at me in stark black and white text, was a massive active secondary lien recorded against the property. My mother had taken out a second mortgage, and it was not a small manageable home equity loan for basic renovations. It was a staggering $400,000 commercial balloon loan. I pulled up the original loan origination documents. The terms were absolutely predatory. It carried a massive variable interest rate and required a crippling monthly payment. But the most damning piece of evidence was the disbursement record. I tracked the wire transfer from the lending bank to see exactly where that $400,000 had gone. It did not go into the family trust checking account. It did not go into a secure retirement fund. The money was wired directly into the corporate operating account of Vanguard Development Partners, Trent's primary fraudulent shell company. I leaned back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal taking my breath away. Trent had not just used Jasmine's credit to run his localized Ponzi scheme. He had manipulated my mother into betting her entire home on his criminal enterprise. I could vividly picture the exact scene in my mother's living room. Trent sitting on her expensive white sofa, sipping her best scotch, using complex terms like liquidity squeeze and short-term margin call. He would have framed it not as a desperate plea for help, but as an exclusive financial opportunity. He would have convinced her that smart, wealthy families leverage their dormant equity to build massive portfolios. He would have promised her a massive return on her investment. And my mother, so completely blinded by her absolute worship of his perceived status and white privilege, had eagerly signed away her dead husband's legacy without consulting an attorney or asking a single critical question. She handed the keys to her kingdom directly to a con artist just because he wore a tailored suit and played the part of the perfect patriarch. But the horror did not stop there. I knew Trent was completely broke. I knew he was actively robbing new investors to pay off old ones. If he was defaulting on his merchant cash advances and forcing Jasmine to beg for baby crib money, there was absolutely no way he was maintaining the massive monthly payments on my mother's second mortgage. I quickly navigated to the county clerk's public foreclosure registry. It is a grim, unforgiving database where banks legally publish the addresses of properties that are severely delinquent before they send law enforcement to seize them. I typed in my mother's address, praying for a fraction of a second that I was wrong. I was not wrong. A formal notice of default had been filed by the lending bank exactly 14 days ago. The loan was 4 months past due. The property was in active pre-foreclosure. My mother's house, the pristine brick colonial with the manicured azalea bushes and the imported Italian marble foyer, the ultimate symbol of her neighborhood supremacy and social standing, was officially scheduled to be auctioned off on the courthouse steps in less than 3 weeks. And the most terrifying part of this entire discovery was that my mother was completely oblivious. If she knew the bank was about to seize her home, she would have been screaming about it at the Sunday dinner. She would have demanded I pay the mortgage arrears instead of Jasmine's bail. Trent had clearly intercepted the mail. He probably volunteered to manage her heavy administrative bills, telling her he was setting up a streamlined accounting system for the family trust to save her time. That gave him direct access to her mailbox and her digital inbox. He systematically hid the past due notices, the aggressive bank warnings, and the final certified notice of default. He let her continue to lease a luxury Mercedes, buy expensive formal wear for church, and brag to her friends, while the ground beneath her feet literally crumbled into dust. I stared at the bright red notice of default glaring from my monitor. The woman who had spent my entire life prioritizing outward appearances over actual substance, who had routinely sacrificed my emotional well-being just to keep up a wealthy facade, was about to be forcibly evicted by the county sheriff. Her entire carefully constructed social identity was about to be publicly annihilated. I did not feel victorious. I felt a deep, sickening wave of disgust. Trent was a parasite who had systematically drained every single ounce of wealth, credit, and dignity from the women in my family. He had expertly exploited their deep insecurities, their vanity, and their desperate need to project perfection to the outside world. I exported the foreclosure documents, the loan origination signatures, and the wire transfer receipts, dropping them straight into my encrypted digital dossier. The financial trap Trent had built was fully armed, and he had placed my mother and my sister right in the center of it. But I was the only one holding the detonator. I organized the files into a precise chronological presentation of absolute destruction. My phone vibrated against the dark wood of my desk, breaking the heavy silence of my office. It was a text message from my mother asking me to call her immediately. It was exactly the kind of pathetic, transparent bait I had been anticipating. I picked up my phone and stared at the bright screen. The text message from my mother was incredibly short, completely lacking her usual passive-aggressive punctuation. It simply read, "Please call me. It is an absolute emergency. I need my daughter." I let the phone sit in my palm for a full minute, watching the screen eventually dim and go black. I knew exactly what this was. This was the pivot. The aggressive bullying tactics had spectacularly failed at the Sunday dinner, and Jasmine's hysterical demands had failed at my apartment this morning. So now they were deploying their final, most potent weapon, the weapon of maternal vulnerability. I tapped the screen and dialed her number. She answered on the very first ring. Kendra. My mother breathed into the receiver, her voice trembling with the absolute perfect pitch of a broken, desperate matriarch. "Oh, thank the Lord you called me back. I was so terrified you were going to ignore me. I have not slept a single wink since you walked out of my house yesterday." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I am here, Mom," I said calmly. "What is the emergency?" She let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation designed to make me feel an overwhelming sense of guilt for causing her such profound physical distress. "It is your sister," my mother wept softly. "Jasmine came over here this morning completely inconsolable. She told me about the awful fight you two had. She told me how harsh you were to her. But Kendra, she is just so incredibly scared. Trent is under an unimaginable amount of pressure right now with his business partners, and she feels like her entire family is completely falling apart. I listened to the carefully chosen words. She was completely glossing over the fact that Jasmine had threatened to have me disinherited just hours ago. She was rewriting the narrative in real time, transforming Jasmine from a toxic aggressor into a fragile victim of circumstance. I understand she is stressed, I replied, offering absolutely nothing for her to grab onto. We need to fix this, Kendra, my mother pleaded, shifting her tone from sorrow to desperate determination. We are a family. Your father would be absolutely heartbroken to see his girls fighting like this. He built this family on love and unity. We cannot let a temporary financial misunderstanding destroy our bond. There it was. The ghost of my father summoned perfectly on cue to enforce my compliance. Trent wants to make things right, she continued, her voice brightening slightly, as if she were delivering wonderful news. He feels terrible about how things escalated at the dinner table. He admits his pride got the better of him. He wants to sit down with you face to face like mature adults. He wants to formally apologize to you, Kendra. He wants to lay all the financial cards on the table and show you exactly what is going on, so we can all move forward and make this family whole again. I closed my eyes and translated her dialogue into reality. Trent wants to make things right meant Trent is completely out of options. He wants to lay all the cards on the table meant he has fabricated a brand new set of fake documents to convince me to give him my money. Make the family whole meant they needed my $100,000 to pay off the angry investors before the police arrived. Where does he want to meet? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and accommodating. He wants to do it properly, my mother said, clearly relieved that I was not putting up a fight. He wants to host a formal meeting at his executive office downtown tomorrow at noon. Just the four of us. A private, secure environment where we can review the business plans and sign a peace treaty. Will you please come, Kendra? Just hear him out. If you walk away after tomorrow, I will never bother you about it again. I promise you. I looked at the bright red notice of default still glaring on my computer monitor. My mother was actively begging me to walk into a trap set by the very man who was currently stealing her home. I will be there, Mom, I said evenly. Tomorrow at noon. Send me the address. Oh, thank you, Kendra, she sobbed, genuine relief flooding her voice. Thank you. I knew my smart, successful girl would do the right thing for her family. I love you so much. I ended the call without saying it back. I dropped the phone onto my desk and let out a harsh, cynical laugh. They honestly believed I was that incredibly naive. They thought the promise of a formal apology and a little bit of maternal validation would completely override my professional instincts. They wanted a private, secure environment so they could isolate me, pressure me, and legally bind me to Trent's sinking ship. I was not going to walk blindly into their slaughterhouse. I was going to bring my own executioner. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Valerie Vance. Valerie was a senior partner at a massive corporate litigation firm in Atlanta. She was a ruthless, terrifyingly brilliant attorney who specialized in dismantling fraudulent corporate structures. We had worked together on several high-profile embezzlement cases, and I knew she lived for exactly this kind of blood sport. I called her direct line. She answered immediately. Kendra, Valerie said, her voice crisp and professional. To what do I owe the pleasure? Tell me you have another multi-million-dollar tax fraud case for me to tear apart. Better, I replied, pulling up my encrypted dossier on the screen. I have a localized real estate Ponzi scheme wrapped in massive elder abuse and identity theft, and the perpetrator is attempting to coerce me into signing a liability transfer tomorrow at noon. I need you on retainer, Valerie, and I need you to review a stack of highly toxic trust documents tonight. Send the files immediately, Valerie said, her tone instantly shifting into battle mode. I will clear my evening schedule. I spent the next 3 hours securely transferring every single piece of evidence I had gathered. I sent Valerie the shell company registrations, Jasmine's ruined credit report, the defaulted merchant cash advances, the forged secondary mortgage on my mother's home, and the active foreclosure notices. We stayed on a secure conference call the entire time, dissecting Trent's strategy. He is going to hit you with a non-disclosure agreement first, Valerie stated over the phone, the sound of her rapid typing echoing in the background. It is the classic amateur fraudster move. He will claim the business plans are highly proprietary, but buried inside that non-disclosure agreement, or perhaps in a secondary asset protection contract, there will be a guarantor clause. He is going to try to legally shift the financial liability of his shell companies onto your clean credit profile. If you sign whatever he slides across that desk tomorrow, you will officially become the primary debtor for over $2 million in fraudulent loans. They are going to use my mother to guilt me into signing it without reading it. I confirmed, feeling a cold wave of absolute clarity wash over me. We will make sure that does not happen, Valerie promised coldly. But we need to lock down his exit strategy. A guy this deeply in debt, facing this many civil lawsuits, does not stick around to face the music. He is buying time for a reason. I am calling my private investigator, Derek. I want to know exactly where Trent's personal passport is and if he has booked any international travel. By 10 o'clock that night, Derek the investigator called us back on the secure line. He was fast, completely discreet, and highly effective. Your brother-in-law is a busy man, Derek reported, his deep voice crackling slightly over the speakerphone. I pulled his recent transaction history through a secure travel registry. He booked a first-class flight on Delta Airlines, departing from Atlanta to San Jose, Costa Rica. When is the flight? I asked, my grip tightening on my pen. Tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock, Derek replied. And Kendra, it is a one-way ticket. There is no return flight booked. And there is only one passenger listed on the itinerary. He is not taking his wife. I let out a slow, heavy breath. Trent was planning to secure my signature at noon, drain whatever cash he could extract from my accounts, and completely abandon Jasmine and my mother to face the federal authorities and the bank foreclosures alone. He was going to leave them holding the bag while he drank cocktails on a beach in Central America. I spent the rest of the night assembling my defense. I did not just keep the files digital. People like my mother and Jasmine do not process digital numbers. They need to feel the physical weight of their destruction. I printed every single document on high-quality, heavy bond paper. I printed the foreclosure notice in stark color. I printed the Costa Rican flight itinerary. I placed every single page into a sleek black leather binder, organizing the evidence with precise tabbed dividers. When the sun finally rose over Atlanta the next morning, I was completely ready. I showered, taking my time to prepare for the absolute most important meeting of my life. I dressed for war. I chose a tailored charcoal gray power suit that fit perfectly, a crisp white silk blouse, and a pair of black designer stilettos that announced my presence with every single step. I pulled my hair back into a flawless, severe bun. I looked in the mirror and saw absolutely no trace of the scared, rejected daughter my family constantly tried to force me to be. I saw a predator at the absolute top of the food chain. I picked up the heavy black leather binder, feeling the solid weight of the truth in my hands. I slipped my phone into my pocket, grabbed my car keys, and walked out of my apartment. I was about to give my family exactly what they had asked for. A formal meeting, all the cards on the table, and the absolute devastating truth. The address my mother had texted me was located in the heart of the downtown Atlanta financial district. From the outside, the towering glass and steel skyscraper looked exactly like the kind of place a multi-million-dollar real estate mogul would operate from. But as soon as I pulled my car into the expensive parking garage and took the elevator up to the 14th floor, the grand illusion instantly shattered. Trent did not lease a private corporate suite. He did not have a dedicated receptionist, mahogany double doors, or a company logo frosted onto the glass. The 14th floor was a massive, trendy co-working space. It was a glorified rental office designed for freelance graphic designers and tech startups. As I walked out of the elevator, I was greeted by neon signs bearing inspirational quotes, a communal coffee bar with kombucha on tap, and open floor plan rows of young people typing away on laptops while wearing headphones. This was the majestic headquarters of Vanguard Development Partners. A rented desk in a shared fishbowl, a man who claimed to be moving $30 million in commercial real estate was operating his entire empire out of a facility that charged by the hour. I approached the front desk and gave my name to the community manager. She smiled, tapped her tablet, and pointed me down a long hallway toward the temporary meeting rooms. I walked slowly, my black designer stilettos clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. I carried my heavy black leather binder tightly against my side. I could feel the adrenaline beginning to hum through my veins, but my heart rate remained perfectly steady. I was walking into the lion's den, but I already knew the lions had no teeth. I reached Conference Room B. It was a small, purely functional space enclosed entirely by soundproof glass walls. I stood outside for a brief moment, observing my family before they noticed my arrival. Trent and Jasmine were sitting on one side of the cheap laminate conference table. Despite the fact that their bank accounts were entirely frozen and they were drowning in millions of dollars of unregulated debt, they were dressed like they were attending an exclusive charity gala. Jasmine was wearing a tailored white Chanel tweed jacket and carrying a pristine Hermes Birkin bag that she had carefully positioned on the table like a shield. Trent was wearing a sharp, custom-fitted Italian navy suit, though I noticed the collar of his expensive dress shirt was slightly damp with sweat. They were clinging to their designer labels like life preservers on a sinking ship. My mother sat at the head of the table. She was wearing her absolute best Sunday church suit, a deep burgundy ensemble with matching pearls. Her hands were clasped tightly together on the table, her knuckles stark white from the tension. She looked exhausted, terrified, and desperate to sweep the entire disaster under the rug. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped into the room. The low murmur of their conversation stopped instantly. Trent immediately stood up, plastering on his signature slick, overly familiar smile. He reached out his hand, as if he were greeting an old friend, instead of the sister-in-law he had just tried to extort. Kendra Trent boomed his voice, echoing slightly in the small glass room. "Thank you so much for coming. Please have a seat. Can I get you an artisanal water? A cappuccino from the front." I did not shake his hand. I did not verbally respond to his fake hospitality. I simply pulled out the ergonomic mesh chair opposite him and sat down. I placed my heavy black leather binder precisely in front of me, keeping my hands resting flat on top of the cover. "Let us skip the beverage service, Trent," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth. "I am on a very tight schedule today. My mother said you had all the cards ready to place on the table, so lay them out." Trent cleared his throat, his fake smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered. He sat back down and adjusted his silk tie. He shot a quick, reassuring glance at Jasmine, who refused to make eye contact with me, keeping her gaze firmly locked on the wall behind my head. "Right to business. I respect that about you, Kendra," Trent said smoothly, slipping right back into his corporate mediator persona. "Listen, I want to start by formally apologizing for the tension this week. Emotions were running high. I was dealing with some massive compliance issues with the city zoning board, and I let that stress bleed into our family dynamic. That was a failure of my leadership as the man of this house, and I take full responsibility for it." I watched him speak, absolutely mesmerized by his ability to lie without a single twitch of his facial muscles. He was apologizing for being stressed, completely erasing the fact that he had orchestrated my sister's arrest and demanded my life savings. "We are a family," Trent continued, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the table. "And family protects each other. I know you were concerned about the liability structures of my development firm. You asked some very sharp questions at dinner. I realized that keeping you in the dark was a mistake, so I had my legal team draft a comprehensive solution." He reached down to his expensive leather briefcase resting on the floor. He pulled out a thick, heavily stapled stack of legal documents. The paper was completely crisp, freshly printed. He slid the massive stack across the laminate table until it stopped right in front of my black binder. "This is a family asset protection plan," Trent announced, tapping the top page with his index finger. "It is a highly proprietary financial restructure. Basically, we are going to consolidate the assets of Vanguard Development Partners with the family trust. By bringing you in as a silent protected partner, we can bypass the current bank freezes, clear up Jasmine's little legal misunderstanding, and ensure that everyone at this table walks away with a massive return on investment when the Midtown project breaks ground next month." I looked down at the thick document. He had put a heavy cardstock cover on it to make it look official. "It is mostly standard legal boilerplate. Trent added quickly, waving his hand dismissively, as if the contents were entirely boring and beneath my intellect. You do not need to get bogged down in the fine print. Your mother has already reviewed the executive summary, and she fully supports the strategy. All I need is your signature on the final page, and we can put this entire ugly week behind us forever. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen, and placed it deliberately on top of the contract. Just sign it. Kendra. Jasmine suddenly spoke up, her voice sharp and irritated. Trent stayed up all night putting this together to save us. Just sign the paper so we can go home. I did not touch the gold pen. I did not look at Jasmine. I slowly reached out, flipped the heavy cardstock cover open, and began reading the actual document. Trent immediately shifted in his chair. The damp sweat on his collar seemed to spread. Kendra, really? He chuckled nervously. We only have this room booked for another 30 minutes. It is 70 pages of legal jargon. My attorneys charge $500 an hour to write that stuff. You do not need to read the whole thing right now. I am a forensic accountant. Trent, I replied coldly, my eyes rapidly scanning the first page. I read legal jargon for fun. If your attorneys actually drafted this, they should be disbarred. I ignored his stammering protests and turned the page. I did not read every single word. I used the specific scanning techniques I utilized during corporate audits. I skipped the meaningless introductory definitions, bypassed the generic non-disclosure agreements he had layered at the front, to look intimidating, and hunted specifically for the financial liability clauses. I knew exactly how scammers buried their traps. They always hid the poison right in the middle of the document, hoping the reader would experience eye fatigue and simply flip to the signature page. I turned past page 10, then page 11, page 12. The room was completely silent except for the crisp sound of the paper turning. The tension radiating from Trent and Jasmine was so thick it was practically choking them. I reached page 14. I stopped turning. My eyes locked onto a section buried under a completely misleading header titled Asset Reallocation Protocol. I read the paragraph twice to ensure my brain was properly processing the sheer unfathomable audacity of what was printed in black and white. It was an irrevocable assignment of guarantee. It explicitly stated that by signing the final page of this document, I, Kendra Washington, was legally agreeing to assume absolute unconditional personal liability for any and all outstanding debts, civil judgments, and commercial loans previously held by Vanguard Development Partners, Apex Real Estate Holdings, and Jasmine Washington. He was not offering me a partnership. He was not consolidating assets. He had drafted a legal suicide note for my financial future. If I signed my name with that gold fountain pen, the millions of dollars in predatory loans he had stolen from those elderly investors would instantly be transferred to my clean Social Security number. The angry construction contractors would be legally allowed to seize my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and my beautiful downtown condo. He was trying to legally wipe his slate completely clean by using my flawless credit as a financial sponge. I slowly looked up from page 14. I did not scream. I did not throw the document back at him. I simply stared at him with an expression of absolute terrifying calm. An assumption of liabilities. I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried perfectly across the glass room. You want me to legally assume the guarantor status for Vanguard Development Partners? Trent turned completely pale. He opened his mouth to deploy another lie, but before he could even form a syllable, my mother slammed her hands down onto the table. Just sign the paper, Kendra, my mother cried out, her voice breaking into a hysterical, desperate sob. I turned to look at her. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She looked at me, not with the loving eyes of a mother, but with the frantic, cornered expression of a woman who was willing to do absolutely anything to protect her social standing. Trent explained it all to me this morning. My mother wept completely, exposing the depths of her betrayal. He told me the business took out some bad loans. He told me the police are going to start asking questions about Jasmine. We cannot let that happen, Kendra. We cannot let your sister go to federal prison. The pastor cannot know about this. The church congregation would absolutely crucify us. We would be ruined. Our entire family name would be completely destroyed in this city. She reached across the table, desperately grasping at the air, as if she could physically force my hand to pick up the pen. "You are single," my mother pleaded, her voice echoing with a cruelty that finally severed the last remaining tie I had to her. "You do not have a husband to embarrass. You do not have children to worry about. You are a smart girl, Kendra. You make a six-figure salary. You can declare bankruptcy and bounce right back in a few years. But Jasmine's life would be over. Please, as your mother, I am begging you to fall on this sword for your sister. Sign the paper and save this family." I looked at Jasmine. She was sitting perfectly still, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She was not crying. She was not begging. She was just watching me, fully expecting me to fold under the crushing weight of our mother's guilt trip. They honestly believed that my life, my career, and my independence were completely expendable. They viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be consumed, a sacrificial lamb waiting to be slaughtered on the altar of their fake wealth. I looked down at the gold fountain pen resting on top of the poisonous contract. I reached out and picked it up. My mother let out a loud gasp of absolute relief, her tears instantly turning to a wet, triumphant smile. Trent exhaled so heavily, his shoulders physically slumped in the chair. They thought they had won. They thought the years of emotional abuse and conditioning had finally broken me. Instead of signing the document, I casually tossed the heavy gold pen over my shoulder. It hit the glass wall behind me with a sharp, loud crack and bounced onto the concrete floor. "I am not signing your confession, Trent," I said, my voice completely devoid of any remaining mercy. I reached out, grabbed the thick family asset protection plan, and shoved it off the edge of the table. It hit the floor, scattering the 70 pages of lies across the cheap corporate carpet. I then placed my hands on the heavy black leather binder sitting in front of me. I flipped the cover open. "I did not come here today to save this family," I announced, looking directly into my mother's terrified eyes. "I came here to show you exactly what your perfect son-in-law has done to it." I reached into the binder and pulled out the very first document. It was printed on heavy, high-quality gloss paper, the stark red lettering at the top completely impossible to ignore. I looked directly at my mother, whose tear-streaked face was frozen in a mask of absolute bewilderment. She had spent the last 10 minutes pouring her heart out, weaponizing her tears to force my compliance. Now she was staring at my hands, completely uncertain of what was about to happen. I placed my fingertips on the top edge of the paper and pushed it slowly across the smooth laminate table. It stopped right in front of her tightly clasped hands. "Read it, Mom," I commanded, my voice completely steady. "Read the header." My mother blinked, her eyes darting from my face down to the document. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her reading glasses with trembling hands, and slipped them onto her face. The room was so quiet, I could hear the harsh, ragged sound of Trent breathing. My mother focused on the page. "Notice of default." She read aloud, her voice wavering, sounding like a confused child. "What does this mean, Kendra? Why does this have my home address on it?" I leaned forward, folding my hands neatly on top of my open binder. "It means you no longer own your home," I stated cleanly, letting the reality strike her with maximum force. 8 months ago, you signed a notarized authorization form, granting Trent the ability to pull a secondary line of credit against the equity of the family trust. You gave him the keys to the house my father spent 30 years paying off. He took out a $400,000 commercial balloon loan against your property, and he has not made a single payment on it in 4 months. My mother physically recoiled, pressing her back against her chair. "No," she whispered vigorously, shaking her head. "No, that is completely impossible. The house is paid for. Trent told me he was just structuring a minor margin allocation to maximize our tax returns. He said the bank needed a temporary collateral placeholder. He promised me the trust was perfectly safe." "He lied to you, Mom," I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through her denial. "He intercepted the warning letters from the bank. He hid the certified mail. He deliberately kept you completely in the dark while the bank initiated active pre-foreclosure. That piece of paper sitting in front of you is a formal legal notification. Your pristine brick colonial house, the one you care about more than your own daughters, is officially scheduled to be auctioned off on the Fulton County Courthouse steps in exactly 18 days. You are going to be evicted by the sheriff. You are going to be homeless. The silence that followed was absolute devastation. My mother slowly turned her head toward Trent. Her eyes were wide, utterly hollow, and filled with a terror so profound it almost made me look away. For my entire life, she had worshipped at the altar of his perceived success. She had sacrificed my emotional well-being to protect his fragile ego. She had literally just begged me to assume millions in fraudulent debt to save his reputation. And now the golden boy had stolen the very foundation of her identity. Trent! My mother choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Tell me she is lying. Tell me my house is safe. Trent swallowed hard. The slick, confident real estate mogul was completely gone. He was sweating profusely, his face pale and clammy. Brenda, listen to me, he stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. It is a temporary liquidity squeeze. The bank jumped the gun. If Kendra just signs the asset reallocation protocol, we can clear the arrears by Friday. Shut your mouth, Trent! I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip across the room. You are not clearing anything by Friday. You took $400,000 of my father's hard-earned legacy, and you funneled it directly into Vanguard Development Partners to pay off a roofing contractor and two elderly investors who were threatening to sue you for fraud. You bled her completely dry, and when she had nothing left to give, you dragged my sister into the crosshairs. I turned my full, unyielding attention to Trent. I pulled the next stack of documents from my binder, the pages heavy with bank statements, routing numbers, and corporate filings. You sit here in your custom Italian suit and rent a glass room by the hour to pretend you are a millionaire. I said my words precise and lethal. But you are nothing but a common thief running a localized Ponzi scheme. Let us look at the real numbers, Trent, not the fake development plans you just threw on the floor. Let us look at the $2.4 million in unregulated commercial debt you accumulated under Apex Real Estate Holdings, Summit, Commercial Ventures, and Vanguard Development Partners. I did not even look at the pages. I had memorized the data. I recited the routing numbers for his Cayman Islands offshore accounts. I listed the names of the independent contractors he had defrauded. I stated the exact dollar amounts he had siphoned from the elderly investors in the suburbs. I watched as Trent's jaw clenched, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass door as if calculating how fast he could physically run out of the building. Jasmine was sitting completely frozen. Her Chanel jacket and Hermes bag suddenly looked like ridiculous costumes on a woman who was legally holding the bag for millions of dollars in federal wire fraud. He made you the sole proprietor, Jasmine. I told her, my tone dropping to a cold, clinical cadence. He made you sign personal guarantees on every single merchant cash advance. When those angry investors finally breach the corporate veil, they are not going to sue Trent. His name is absolutely nowhere on the official state registry. They are going to sue you. They are going to seize your bank accounts, garnish your wages, and take your heavily mortgaged house. You are legally responsible for every single dime he stole. Jasmine let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She looked at Trent, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently. You told me those papers were just administrative, she cried out, her voice cracking with sheer panic. You told me I was the vice president of acquisitions. You said we were building an empire. Trent slammed his fist onto the table, finally dropping the pathetic nice guy act. His face twisted into a snarl of pure, unfiltered rage. Shut up, Jasmine, he barked, his voice dripping with absolute venom. You happily spent the money. You drove the leased cars. You bought the designer clothes. Do not sit there and play the innocent victim when you enjoyed every single second of the lifestyle I provided for you. His sudden explosion of anger made my mother flinch, but I did not move a single muscle. You did not provide a lifestyle, Trent, I countered smoothly. You provided a highly orchestrated illusion, and you always knew it was going to collapse. That is why you set up the absolute perfect exit strategy. I reached into the very back of my black leather binder. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a complex financial document or a heavily redacted bank statement. It was a brightly colored printout from Delta Airlines. I slid it across the table. It came to a stop right between Trent and Jasmine. I watched Jasmine's eyes track the paper. She leaned forward, her brow furrowing in confusion as she read the large, bold text at the top of the page. "That is a confirmed flight itinerary," I announced, ensuring every single syllable echoed with absolute finality. "Flight number 482, departing Atlanta tomorrow evening at exactly 8 o'clock, arriving in San Jose, Costa Rica, a country with notoriously complex extradition treaties." Jasmine looked up at her husband, her face completely drained of color. "You are going to Costa Rica," she whispered, the devastating reality finally penetrating her thick wall of denial. "Tomorrow. Why are you going to Costa Rica tomorrow?" "Because he knows the police are already closing in," I answered for him, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Trent. "Because he knows the bank is foreclosing on Mom's house in 18 days. Because he knows the angry investors are filing federal civil suits this week. He was going to use my signature today to drain my accounts, pack his bags, and get on that plane tomorrow night." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence fill the room before I dropped the final absolute killing blow. "Look at the passenger list, Jasmine. Look at the ticket class." Jasmine's trembling eyes dropped back down to the printed itinerary. A single tear broke free, slicing through her makeup and dropping onto her white Chanel lapel. "It is a one-way ticket," I stated coldly. "First class, for exactly one passenger." Trent booked a single ticket to Costa Rica. He was never planning to take you with him. He was going to leave you here to face the federal prosecutors alone. He was going to abandon you to rot in a federal prison while he drank on a beach with my life savings. The silence in the small glass room shattered into a million jagged pieces. Jasmine let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a guttural, agonizing scream of pure heartbreak and absolute humiliation. She grabbed her pristine white Hermes Birkin bag, the ultimate symbol of her fake wealth, and swung it wildly across the table, slamming it directly into Trent's face. "You lying bastard!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing violently through the soundproof glass and drawing the attention of every single tech startup worker in the open floor plan outside. "You were going to leave me. You were going to let me go to prison." Trent stumbled backward, his chair tipping over and crashing loudly onto the concrete floor. He caught his balance and grabbed Jasmine's wrists, twisting them violently until she dropped the heavy leather bag. He pushed her away with such aggressive force that she crashed into the whiteboard behind her. "Do not touch her!" my mother screamed, finally snapping out of her paralyzed shock. She lunged forward to protect her golden child, raising her hands to push Trent away. Trent swatted my mother aside, like she was an absolute nuisance. The charming, polite Southern gentleman facade completely dissolved. His face was twisted into a red, sweaty mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. He looked at my mother and my sister, the two women who had worshipped him, with absolute blistering disgust. "Get your hands off me!" Trent spat, his voice dropping into a vicious, terrifying growl. "You are both pathetic. You sit there crying like victims, but you made this incredibly easy for me. You were so absolutely desperate to look like you belonged in the upper class. You were so incredibly desperate to have a successful white man validate your miserable, insecure existence." My mother gasped, clutching her burgundy church suit as if he had just shot her point blank in the chest. "Look at you," Trent mocked, pointing a shaking finger directly in my mother's face. "You skipped paying your property taxes just so you could buy imported marble and lease a Mercedes to impress a bunch of old ladies at your church. You practically begged me to take your house. You did not even read the loan documents. You just signed your dead husband's legacy away because I wore a nice watch and smiled at you. You cared more about showing me off at the country club than you did about protecting your own daughter." He turned his vicious gaze back to Jasmine, who was sliding down the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. "And you," Trent sneered, kicking her expensive handbag across the room. "You were nothing but a prop. A beautiful, stupid prop that I used to secure credit lines because the banks liked your clean financial history. You thought you were a real estate mogul. You cannot even balance a basic checking account. You spent thousands of dollars every week on designer shoes and luxury vacations while the business was drowning in debt, and you never once asked where the money was coming from. You lived in an absolute fantasy world, Jasmine. I just let you play make-believe while I took what I needed." The absolute vitriol in his voice exposed the deep, rotting core of his character. He had never respected them. He had never viewed them as his equal. He saw their racial insecurities and their desperate adherence to respectability politics, and he weaponized it to bleed them completely dry. "You are a monster," my mother wept, wrapping her arms around Jasmine on the floor. "I am a survivor," Trent barked back, completely devoid of any remorse. "And I am not going to federal prison because of you incompetent people." Trent finally turned his crazed, desperate eyes back to me. I had not moved from my chair. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the open black leather binder. I watched him completely self-destruct with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. "You think you are so brilliant," Kendra Trent hissed, taking a heavy step toward my side of the table. "You think printing out a few bank statements makes you untouchable? You think you can just walk in here, ruin my entire life, and walk back out to your perfect corporate job?" He glanced down at the massive stack of original foreclosure notices, routing numbers, and the printed flight itinerary sitting right in front of me. In his panicked, cornered state, his rational brain had completely shut down. He honestly believed that if he could just destroy the physical papers sitting on the table, he could somehow erase the digital paper trail that was already actively hunting him down. "I am going to take that binder," Trent threatened, his breathing heavy and ragged. "I am going to shred every single piece of paper in it, and then I am getting on that plane tonight. You are not going to stop me." Trent planted his hands on the edge of the laminate table and lunged directly across the surface. He scrambled like a wild animal, knocking over the heavy crystal water glasses and scattering the 70-page fake asset protection contract everywhere. He reached his hands out violently, his fingers clawing toward the black leather binder resting right in front of my chest. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I simply pulled the binder 1 inch out of his reach and looked directly at the glass door behind him. Right as Trent's fingertips grazed the edge of my files, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open with massive force. It hit the metal doorstop with a loud, ringing crack that froze Trent completely in his tracks. "Step back from the table and put your hands where we can see them," a deep, booming voice commanded. Trent slowly turned his head. Standing in the doorway were 3 large men wearing plainclothes suits, their golden badges hanging prominently from chains around their necks. They did not look like the tech startup workers outside. They moved with the synchronized heavy authority of seasoned law enforcement officers. "Atlanta Police Department Fraud Division." The lead detective announced, stepping into the room and immediately positioning himself between Trent and the door. The other 2 detectives flanked him, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The air in the room instantly vanished. Jasmine stopped sobbing, her breath catching in her throat. My mother sat frozen on the floor, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. Trent slowly pushed himself off the conference table, his hands trembling violently as he raised them into the air. The arrogant white savior who had just screamed racial and classist insults at my family was suddenly completely terrified. "What is this?" Trent stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "You cannot be here. This is a private corporate meeting." The lead detective pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and snapped it open. "We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Trent Davis on multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and elder financial abuse," the detective read cleanly. Trent spun around to face me. His eyes were completely wide with sheer panic. He looked at the heavy black binder, then up at my perfectly calm face. "You called the police?" he whispered, the absolute finality of his situation finally crushing him. "You brought the cops to my office." I slowly stood up from my ergonomic chair, picking up my black leather binder and clutching it securely to my side. I looked at the man who had tried to steal my life savings, ruin my career, and destroy my family, and I delivered the absolute final blow. "I did not bring my checkbook today, Trent," I said, my voice echoing with icy, unrelenting authority. "But I did bring the police. I sent them your LLC records 3 days ago." The lead detective stepped forward, grabbed Trent by his expensive tailored shoulder, and spun him around to face the whiteboard. Trent offered absolutely zero resistance. He went completely limp, his massive ego entirely shattered. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the small glass room was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard. "You have the right to remain silent," the second detective recited, pulling Trent's arms tightly behind his back. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Wait!" Trent cried out, turning his head frantically toward my mother. "Brenda, call my lawyer. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we were just negotiating a business deal." My mother did not say a single word. She just stared at him, the horrifying reality of her impending homelessness and her completely ruined social reputation cementing her jaw shut. The detectives did not wait for a family goodbye. They pulled Trent away from the wall and marched him directly out of the glass conference room. I stepped out into the hallway and watched the absolute spectacle unfold. Every single person in the massive co-working space had stopped working. The graphic designers, the tech startup kids, and the community managers were all standing at their rented desks, holding up their cell phones and recording the entire scene. Trent was forced to walk the long, humiliating gauntlet. The man who had been so incredibly obsessed with portraying the perfect image of massive wealth and unshakable privilege was currently being... Perp walked out of a rented office building in front of 50 strangers. He kept his head down, trying to hide his face from the camera lenses, but the damage was already permanently done. His reputation was entirely annihilated. The third detective remained in the conference room. He walked over to where Jasmine was still sitting on the floor clutching her ruined Chanel jacket. He looked down at her with a stern, completely unsympathetic expression. "Jasmine Washington," the detective said, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "My partner is going to need you to come down to the precinct with us immediately. We have several limited liability companies registered in your name that are directly tied to these fraudulent accounts. We need to ask you some very serious questions about your involvement in Vanguard Development Partners." Jasmine let out a sharp, terrified wail. "No," she begged, looking up at the detective with fresh tears streaming down her face. "I did not do anything. He lied to me. He forged my signatures." "You can explain all of that to the district attorney," the detective replied coldly. "Please stand up, ma'am." My mother scrambled to her feet, completely ignoring Jasmine and rushing directly toward me. She grabbed my arm, her manicured fingernails digging painfully into my tailored blazer. "Kendra," my mother sobbed, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "You have to fix this. You know the law. You are a forensic accountant. You have to call your attorney friends and get Jasmine out of this. You have to help me save the house before the bank takes it. Please, Kendra. I am your mother. You cannot just leave us like this." I looked down at her hand clutching my arm. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, agonizing reservoir of guilt that she had manipulated for 35 years was completely dry. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my jacket. I stepped back, creating a permanent physical and emotional distance between us. "You made your choices, Mom," I said quietly, ensuring she heard every single word over the sound of Jasmine's hysterical crying. "You chose his fake wealth over my actual hard work. You were completely willing to let me sign away my entire financial future just to save your reputation at the church. You did not care if I lost everything as long as you got to keep your imported marble foyer." "But I did not know," my mother pleaded, clasping her hands together in prayer. "I did not understand what he was doing." "You did not want to understand," I corrected her. "You just wanted the illusion. And now you have to pay the absolute full price for it." I turned my back on them. I walked out of the conference room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. I did not look back at Jasmine being questioned by the detective. I did not look back at my mother weeping alone in the middle of the fake corporate office. I walked straight to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and rode it down in complete beautiful silence. The elevator ride down to the ground floor was incredibly peaceful. For the first 30 seconds of that descent, I was entirely alone with the quiet hum of the mechanical cables. I closed my eyes and let the cool, recycled air wash over my face. The heavy, suffocating weight that I had carried on my shoulders for 35 years was completely gone. I had finally severed the toxic strings my family had used to control me. But my peaceful isolation was only temporary. As the polished steel doors slid open to the massive sunlit atrium of the main lobby, I stepped out into a bustling crowd of corporate professionals. I adjusted my heavy black leather binder under my arm and began walking toward the front exit. But before I could reach the revolving glass doors, the dedicated security elevator across the lobby chimed loudly. The oversized doors parted and the absolute spectacular destruction of my family spilled directly into the public square. The lead detective marched Trent out first. Trent's wrists were tightly secured behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The custom Italian Navy suit he was so incredibly proud of was completely rumpled and hanging awkwardly off his frame. He kept his head bowed, staring intently at the polished marble floor, refusing to make eye contact with the dozens of executive security guards and administrative assistants who had completely stopped in their tracks to watch the spectacle. The slick, arrogant real estate mogul had been permanently reduced to a terrified criminal taking his final walk of shame. Right behind him came Jasmine, and to my genuine surprise, her wrists were also bound in cold steel. The detectives had not just asked her to come down to the precinct for a polite interview. Based on the mountain of forged corporate documents and defaulted loan applications I had handed over, they were officially detaining her as an active co-conspirator. Jasmine was fighting against the female officer's grip, dragging her feet and wailing in a breathless, hysterical tone. Her perfectly silk-pressed hair had fallen around her face in sweaty, tangled strands. She was frantically twisting her arms, desperately trying to hide her handcuffed wrists under the fabric of her ruined white Chanel jacket. Even in the absolute lowest moment of her life, as she was being hauled away to a federal holding facility, her only concern was that someone from her exclusive country club might be walking through the downtown lobby and see her looking so utterly disgraceful. And trailing frantically behind the detectives was my mother. She was practically hyperventilating. Her pristine burgundy church suit was completely disheveled, and her expensive pearls swung wildly against her chest as she struggled to keep up with the fast pace of the police officers. She was loudly begging the detectives to let her ride in the cruiser, begging them to cover Jasmine's hands with a jacket, begging them to think about what the church congregation would say if this made the evening news. Then her frantic, bloodshot eyes scanned the massive lobby and locked onto me standing near the exit. She completely abandoned Trent and Jasmine. My mother broke into a desperate run across the marble floor, her expensive heels clicking loudly, echoing through the cavernous atrium. She reached me just as I turned to face her. Before I could take a step back, my mother collapsed. Her knees hit the hard marble floor with a heavy thud. She wrapped her arms around my legs, completely destroying whatever microscopic shred of dignity she had left. "Kendra." My mother sobbed, her voice echoing loudly enough for every single person in the lobby to hear. "Please do not leave us. Please, I am begging you. You have to fix this." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was too loud, too ambitious, and fundamentally unlovable. I looked at the woman who had just 30 minutes ago tried to coerce me into signing away my entire financial future to save her own social reputation. "You have to pay for the lawyers," my mother wailed, burying her tear-stained face against my tailored trousers. "You have $100,000 sitting in your savings account. You can hire the best criminal defense team in Atlanta. You can get Jasmine out on bail again. You can pay the bank and stop the foreclosure on my house. You have the money, Kendra. You are the only one who can save this family from complete ruin." She was still completely blind. Even after watching Trent verbally abuse her, even after learning he was planning to flee to Costa Rica and leave them all to rot, her fundamental programming had not changed. She still viewed my hard-earned wealth as a communal family emergency fund. She still expected me to set myself entirely on fire just to keep her comfortable illusions warm. I reached down and firmly grasped her shoulders. I pulled her up from the floor, forcing her to stand on her own 2 feet. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric of my trousers, and looked directly into her frantic, weeping eyes. "I am not paying for your lawyers, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm and resonating with absolute unbreakable authority. "I am not bailing Jasmine out of jail, and I am absolutely not saving your house." My mother gasped, clutching her chest, as if she could not physically process the words I was speaking. "But you have the money," she cried out, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "It is your duty. You are supposed to honor your mother." Biology does not demand financial martyrdom. I told her, delivering my final thesis on my own self-worth. You do not get to treat me like a disposable scapegoat for 35 years and then demand I play the savior when your golden child burns the house down. You chose Trent. You chose the illusion of wealth over actual integrity. You made your bed with a con artist and now you have to lie in it. I shifted my black leather binder to my other hand, feeling lighter than I ever had in my entire life. And for the record, I continued, a slow, deeply satisfying smile spreading across my face. I do not have $100,000 sitting in my savings account anymore. My mother stopped crying instantly. She stared at me, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure confusion. What do you mean? She whispered. I had a very busy morning before I came to this pathetic meeting, I explained smoothly. I stopped by my real estate agent's office. I sat down with a notary and the title company. And I used every single penny of my hard-earned savings to place a massive down payment on a stunning multi-level modern home in a beautiful gated community on the north side of the city. I watched the realization slowly wash over her face. The money she had been counting on, the emergency fund she felt absolutely entitled to, was permanently gone. It was locked into solid equity. It has a beautiful chef's kitchen, soaring high ceilings, and a massive backyard, I said, driving the final nail into the coffin of her entitlement. And the absolute best part is that my name is the only name on the title deed. I bought my dream house, Mom, and you will never have the address. My mother let out a tiny broken whimper. She reached a trembling hand out toward me, but she stopped halfway, finally realizing that the invisible barrier between us was now completely impenetrable. She had nothing left to threaten me with. The trust was empty. The house was foreclosed. Her favorite daughter was in the back of a police cruiser, and the daughter she had always underestimated had just successfully outmaneuvered all of them. I did not wait for her to formulate another excuse. I turned my back on her for the absolute final time. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out of the air-conditioned lobby into the bright, glorious Atlanta sunshine. The heat of the afternoon felt incredible. The air tasted entirely different. It tasted like absolute freedom. I walked across the pavement toward the parking garage, my designer stilettos clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the concrete. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from my realtor, accompanied by a picture of a shiny set of keys resting on a beautiful marble kitchen counter. The house is officially yours, the message read. Congratulations, Kendra. I smiled, unlocking my car door and tossing my heavy leather binder onto the passenger seat. I slid behind the steering wheel, put on my dark sunglasses, and started the engine. The powerful hum of the motor filled the cabin. I did not look back at the corporate building. I did not care what happened to Trent in federal court, or how Jasmine would survive in a holding cell, or where my mother would live when the bank finally changed her locks. That was their tragedy to navigate. I had a brand new house to furnish, a massive corporate promotion to secure, and an entirely new, brilliantly unburdened life to live. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out into the city traffic, leaving the toxic wreckage of my past completely in the rearview mirror. The hardest truth I had to accept was that biology does not demand financial martyrdom. For years, I thought being a good daughter and sister meant shrinking myself and sacrificing my hard-earned security to fund their illusions. But true empowerment comes from recognizing that your peace and your wallet are not communal properties. You cannot save people who are entirely committed to their own toxic delusions. When you stop seeking validation from those who only value you for what they can extract from you, you finally gain the absolute freedom to build a beautiful, unburdened life for yourself. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story of independence in the comments below.